The carriage door slammed shut like a coffin lid, and Evelyn Hartwell realized she was being buried alive, not in earth, but in silk and promises. In 3 days, she would marry Judge Cornelius Blackwood, a man whose hands trembled with age and whose eyes held nothing but possession. Her father had made his choice. The family name, the crumbling fortune, the social standing, all would be saved by her sacrifice. But as Evelyn stood in her bedroom that final night, staring at the wedding dress that hung like a shroud, she understood with absolute clarity. Some fates are worse than death, and some choices are worth losing everything. Before we journey into Evelyn's story of courage and defiance, I invite you to stay with me until the very end, because what happens when a woman chooses herself over society's chains will surprise you. And please comment below with your city or country so I can see how far this story of freedom and love travels across the world. The Montana Territory stretched vast and unforgiving beyond the windows of the Hartwell mansion, but Evelyn had never been allowed to truly see it. For 22 years, she had lived behind beveled glass and heavy curtains, a carefully cultivated flower in a greenhouse built by her father's silver fortune. She had been taught to pour tea with grace, to speak French with a Parisian accent, to play Chopin on the grand piano in the parlor. She had been taught everything except how to live, but she had never been taught how to die either, and that's what marriage to Judge Cornelius Blackwood would be. A slow, suffocating death of everything she was or might become. "You're being hysterical, Evelyn." Her father's voice cut through the tension in his study like a blade through silk. Marcus Hartwell stood behind his massive mahogany desk, his face ruddy with anger and brandy. "Women of your station don't have the luxury of romance. They have duty." Evelyn stood before him in her morning dress of pale blue, a color he'd chosen because it made her look innocent, malleable. Her hands were clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles had gone white, but she kept her voice steady. She had learned that much from her mother before consumption had taken her 3 years ago. A woman's power often lay in her composure. "Duty to what, father? To a man who's 67 years old? Who's buried 2 wives already?" She took a breath, feeling her corset constrict against her ribs. "Judge Blackwood looks at me like I'm a prize mare he's purchasing. Not a wife, not a partner, property." Marcus slammed his hand on the desk, rattling the crystal inkwell. "He's a federal judge. He has connections in Washington, influence that reaches to the territorial governor himself. His patronage could restore everything we've lost." "Everything you've lost," Evelyn corrected quietly. "The silver mines failed because you invested poorly, father. Because you trusted the wrong partners. Because you gambled our future on ventures that—" "Enough!" His roar filled the study, and Evelyn flinched despite herself. She had seen her father angry before, had watched him rage at mine foremen, at servants, at her mother during the final years when the fortune began to crumble. But she had never been the direct target of his fury. Until now. He came around the desk, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn felt afraid of the man who had once lifted her onto his shoulders to watch 4th of July fireworks. The man before her now was a stranger wearing her father's face, desperate, dangerous, cornered. "You will marry Judge Blackwood in 3 days' time," Marcus said, his voice dropping to something worse than a shout, a cold, deliberate threat. "You will smile, you will say your vows, and you will be grateful that a man of his standing would overlook your advancing age and lack of substantial dowry. Do you understand me?" "I'm 22, father, hardly a spinster. In Montana Territory with our finances in ruins and creditors circling like vultures." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're fortunate Blackwood finds you appealing. Another year and you'll have no prospects at all. I'll be forced to lease this house, and we'll be reduced to living in some boarding establishment in town, working for our keep like common—" "Then let us work," Evelyn interrupted, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Let me find employment. I could teach piano or French or a Hartwell woman working for wages." Marcus's face purpled. "I would rather die than see my daughter reduced to a common laborer. Your mother would turn in her grave." Evelyn felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her mother had been the one person who understood her, who had whispered to her on quiet evenings that a woman's heart mattered as much as her duty. But her mother had also been trapped. married at 16 to a man her parents chose, bearing that prison with grace until illness offered the only escape. Mother told me before she died that she wished she'd been braver, Evelyn said softly. She made me promise that I would choose my own path, even if it was harder, especially if it was harder. Something flickered across Marcus's face. Pain, perhaps, or memory, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by cold determination. Your mother was delirious with fever at the end. She didn't know what she was saying. He returned to his desk, opening a ledger as if the conversation was concluded. The wedding is scheduled for Saturday at 2 o'clock. Judge Blackwood will arrive Friday evening for the rehearsal dinner. I suggest you spend the intervening time adjusting your attitude. Dismissed. Evelyn stood frozen, unable to believe he could discuss her future, her life, as casually as a business transaction. And if I refuse? Marcus didn't look up from his ledger. Then you'll have no future to discuss. No home, no family, no prospects. You'll be cast out with nothing, and in this territory, a woman alone doesn't survive long. The wilderness is full of dangers, Evelyn. Wild animals, lawless men, starvation, disease. Is your pride worth dying for? It's not about pride. It's about, I don't care what it's about. Now he did look up, and his eyes were as cold as a Montana winter. Choose, Evelyn. Marriage to a respectable man of standing, or destitution and very likely death. Those are your options. There are no others. The study door opened, and Evelyn turned to see Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, standing in the doorway with her usual disapproving expression. The older woman had never liked Evelyn, had always favored her father's authority over any independence Evelyn attempted to show. The dressmaker is here for the final fitting, Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Pemberton announced. Your wedding gown requires adjustments. I won't be needing, Evelyn began, but her father cut her off. She'll be up directly, Mrs. Pemberton. Thank you. The housekeeper withdrew, and father and daughter stared at each other across the Persian rug that had once symbolized their wealth and now was just another artifact of better days. 3 days, Evelyn, Marcus said finally. I expect you to come to your senses before then. Evelyn turned and walked from the study, her back straight and her head high, even though everything inside her was screaming. She climbed the wide staircase to her bedroom, passing portraits of Hartwell ancestors who seemed to judge her from their gilded frames. Women in the family had always married well, always done their duty. She was the aberration, the flaw in an otherwise perfect lineage. Her bedroom was exactly as it had always been. Pale yellow wallpaper with tiny roses, a 4-poster bed with lace curtains, a writing desk by the window where she'd spent countless hours composing letters to school friends who had all married and moved away. It was a beautiful cage, and she had never truly recognized it as such until now. The wedding dress hung on the wardrobe door, a confection of white silk and Belgian lace that must have cost more than their cook earned in a year. Judge Blackwood had insisted on paying for it, along with the entire wedding. My gift to my bride, he'd said when he presented the dressmaker, his hand lingering too long on Evelyn's shoulder, his breath stale with cigar smoke. She had smiled and thanked him because that's what was expected. She had become so good at doing what was expected. Evelyn moved to her writing desk and pulled out a sheet of paper, dipping her pen in ink. But what could she write? Who would help her? Her school friends were all married, absorbed into their husbands' lives and concerns. Her mother's family had cut ties with the Hartwells years ago after some business dispute. She had cousins back east, but they were strangers who would likely side with her father. A woman's duty was to marry well, after all. The pen hovered over the blank page, and Evelyn realized with crushing certainty that she was alone. A knock at the door made her start. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Pemberton, or perhaps the dressmaker. Instead, Annie Walsh slipped into the room, closing the door quickly behind her. Annie was the upstairs maid, barely 19, with red hair that constantly escaped her cap and green eyes that sparkled with mischief. She was the only person in the house who treated Evelyn like a friend rather than a burden. "Miss Evelyn, I heard," Annie whispered, rushing to the desk. "Mrs. Pemberton was gossiping with Cook about how your father gave you an ultimatum. Is it true? You'll really be thrown out if you won't marry the judge." Evelyn nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Annie knelt beside the chair, taking Evelyn's hands in her own work-roughened ones. Then you have to leave, tonight, before the wedding. Leave? Annie, where would I go? I have no money. No, you have this. Annie pressed something into Evelyn's palm, a small velvet pouch that jingled softly. It's $43. I've been saving my wages for 3 years, planning to go west and open my own boarding house someday. But you need it more than I do. Annie, no, I can't take your savings. Your dream? My dream can wait, Annie said firmly. Yours can't. Miss Evelyn, I've seen the way Judge Blackwood looks at you, like you're something he bought, and I've seen what happens to women who marry men like that. My aunt married a man for security, and he... She trailed off, but her expression said enough. You're different from other ladies. You're kind. You read to me when I was sick, remember? Taught me proper grammar so I could better myself. You treated me like a person, not just a servant. Let me help you now. Evelyn stared at the pouch in her hand, feeling the weight of coins and possibility. $43. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. It was a chance. There's a westbound stagecoach that leaves from Miller's Station tomorrow at dawn, Annie continued, speaking quickly now. It goes to Red Willow, Wyoming. I have a cousin there, Mary Walsh. She runs a boarding house near the center of town. I'll write you a letter of introduction. It's rough country, but honest. You could start over there, Miss Evelyn. Be whoever you want to be. Tomorrow? Evelyn's heart hammered. But the wedding is 3 days away. If I disappear now, Father will search for me. He'll use his connections, the judge's influence, which is exactly why you need to leave before the wedding, Annie pointed out. Once you're married, you'll be the judge's property. He can legally do whatever he wants, but right now, you're just a runaway daughter. Your father's pride might keep him from pursuing you too hard. Wouldn't want society to know his daughter chose poverty over a prestigious marriage. It made a terrible kind of sense. Evelyn looked around her bedroom at the life she'd always known. She thought of the piano in the parlor, the books in the library, the rose garden her mother had planted. She thought of summer evenings on the veranda, winter mornings by the fire, the familiar rhythms of a predictable existence. Then she thought of Judge Blackwood's liver-spotted hands, his wet lips when he'd kissed her hand, the way his eyes traveled over her body as if appraising livestock. She thought of burying his children, managing his household, smiling through diplomatic dinners while her soul withered inside her. "Help me pack," Evelyn whispered. Annie's face broke into a relieved smile. The two women moved quickly and quietly, pulling out a small leather valise from beneath the bed. They couldn't take much. Too much luggage would draw attention. Evelyn chose practically for the first time in her life. 2 simple day dresses, a warm wool cloak, sturdy boots, undergarments, a nightgown. She left the silks and satins, the party dresses and dancing slippers. Where she was going, she wouldn't need them. From her jewelry box, she took only her mother's locket and a plain pair of pearl earrings. Nothing too valuable that might attract thieves, but enough that she could sell them if desperate. The rest, the ruby necklace her father had given her for her 21st birthday, the diamond hair combs, the emerald brooch, she left behind. Let them be sold to pay his debts. Annie produced a worn split skirt and simple blouse from her own trunk. "For traveling, miss. You can't board a westbound stage looking like a silver princess. You'll need to blend in, look like you belong." Evelyn held up the practical garments, so different from anything she'd ever worn. They represented everything she'd never been allowed to be. Ordinary, independent, free. "What about my hair?" Evelyn asked, touching the elaborate arrangement that had taken her maid an hour to create that morning. "We'll braid it simple," Annie said, already unpinning the complicated twists. "And you should use my surname if anyone asks. Say you're Evelyn Walsh, coming west to join family. It's close enough to true. You'll be finding my cousin." As Annie worked, loosening Evelyn's hair from its pins and combing it into a simple braid, Evelyn felt transformation beginning. With each garment she removed, each luxury she set aside, she was shedding not just clothing, but identity. Evelyn Hartwell, daughter of Marcus Hartwell, the girl who had been groomed for society and advantageous marriage, that person was being left behind in this yellow bedroom with its rose wallpaper and silk curtains. "Miss Evelyn," Annie said softly, tying off the braid. "Once you walk out that door tomorrow, you can't come back. You understand that, don't you? Even if things are hard out there, even if you're scared or hungry or lonely, you can't change your mind. I know, Evelyn said, meeting Annie's eyes in the mirror. I'd rather face uncertainty than certainty of misery. Annie nodded and handed her a folded piece of paper. I wrote that letter for my cousin Mary. Tell her I sent you, that you're trustworthy. She'll help you find work, a place to stay. The boarding house isn't fancy, but it's respectable. Evelyn tucked the letter carefully into her valise alongside the velvet pouch of coins. $43 and a letter of introduction. It wasn't much to build a new life on, but it was all she had. They finished packing as the sun set beyond the mountains, painting the room in shades of amber and shadow. Evelyn changed into Annie's clothing, feeling strange and exposed in the practical garments. The split skirt allowed for easier movement. The blouse was simpler than anything she'd owned, and the wool jacket was warm but unadorned. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. You look like someone who can survive, Annie said approvingly. Now hide the valise under your bed. Tomorrow morning you'll wait until your father leaves for his office. He goes at 7 sharp, always has. Mrs. Pemberton does her marketing on Thursdays, leaves at 7:30. The other servants will be busy with morning chores. You'll have maybe 30 minutes to slip out the servants' entrance and make it to Miller's station. The stage leaves at dawn, Evelyn pointed out. That's earlier than 7. The dawn stage is the mail run. Goes straight through to Cheyenne. Too public, too many questions. There's a passenger coach that leaves at 8. Still westbound, but makes more stops. Better for someone who doesn't want attention. Evelyn marveled at Annie's planning, at the quick intelligence she'd always known the girl possessed, but had been hidden behind a maid's cap and deference. You should be running a business, Annie. You have the mind for it. Annie smiled. Maybe someday I will, but first let's get you running toward your future instead of away from it. They hid the valise and spent the evening as normally as possible. Evelyn endured the dressmaker's final fitting, standing like a mannequin while the woman pinned and tucked the wedding gown. She joined her father for a silent dinner, pushing roast beef and potatoes around her plate, while he read through legal documents, treating her presence as irrelevant now that he'd issued his ultimatum. I trust you've reconsidered your foolishness, Marcus said as dessert was served. Yes, father, Evelyn replied, because it was easier than arguing. Let him believe he'd won. It would make her escape easier. He nodded, satisfied. Good. Judge Blackwood arrives tomorrow evening. I expect you to be gracious. Of course, father. That night, Evelyn lay in her bed for the last time, staring at the ceiling she'd memorized over 22 years of captivity. She thought of her mother, wondered if the woman who had whispered encouragement from her deathbed would be proud or horrified by what her daughter planned to do. She thought of the vast territory beyond these walls, the unknown dangers and possibilities that waited. Fear nearly paralyzed her. What did she know of the real world? She could play Chopin and pour tea and make polite conversation in French, but could she survive in rough country? Could she work for her living, scrub floors, cook meals, do whatever needed doing? She had lived her entire life as ornamental, decorative. What if she discovered she was useless? But then she thought of Judge Blackwood's hands, and fear of the unknown became less terrifying than certainty of the known. Sleep came in fragments, and when dawn light finally crept through her curtains, Evelyn rose with grim determination. She dressed in Annie's borrowed clothes, braided her hair as simply as possible, and waited. At precisely 7 o'clock, she heard her father's footsteps on the stairs, the front door opening and closing. At 7:32, Mrs. Pemberton called out to cook that she was off to the market. Evelyn counted to 100, then slipped from her room. The house felt different in her practical clothes, as if she was seeing it through new eyes. The grand staircase she'd descended in silk ball gowns now felt like a monument to excess. The portraits of ancestors seemed less august and more accusing. She moved quickly through the servants' hallway, knowing the staff would be occupied with morning duties in the back of the house. The servants' entrance was unlocked. Annie had seen to that. Evelyn stepped out into the cool Montana morning, valise in hand, and felt the first breath of freedom. The mountains rose in the distance, snow-capped and eternal. The valley spread below, dotted with mine works and settlements. Somewhere out there was Miller's station, and beyond that, a westbound stage. She had taken perhaps 10 steps when a voice stopped her cold. "Going somewhere, daughter?" Evelyn spun to find her father standing beside the carriage house, still in his morning suit, his face as hard as granite. Behind him, Mrs. Pemberton emerged from the shadows, smug satisfaction written across her features. "Did you think I wouldn't notice your little conspiracy?" Marcus advanced slowly. "Mrs. Pemberton came to me last night, reported that the maid had been helping you pack. Annie Walsh has been dismissed and sent packing, by the way. As for you—" "Let me go," Evelyn said, and was surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "Just let me go, Father. You'll be free of the burden of a disobedient daughter, and I'll be free of a marriage I don't want. Everyone benefits." "Everyone benefits?" Marcus's laugh was bitter. "I've spent weeks negotiating this arrangement. Judge Blackwood has already paid your bride price." "Yes, Evelyn, there was a price. He's canceled debts I owed, promised political favors, offered connections that will rebuild everything I've lost. And you think I'll let you walk away and destroy all of that?" "A bride price," Evelyn repeated, feeling sick. "You sold me." "I arranged for your future," he corrected, "as is my right as your father. Now you'll return to your room, you'll burn those ridiculous clothes, and you'll prepare yourself properly for the judge's arrival tonight." Or what?" Evelyn challenged. "You'll lock me in? Drag me to the altar in chains? How will that look to your precious society, Father?" His eyes narrowed. "Or I'll declare you mentally unsound. Judge Blackwood has already agreed to sign the commitment papers. We'll tell society you've suffered a nervous collapse, had to be sent to the territorial asylum for your own protection. You'll spend your wedding night in a cell instead of a marriage bed, sedated with laudanum and locked away from decent people. Is that what you want?" The threat was so monstrous that for a moment Evelyn couldn't breathe. The territorial asylum was a nightmare place where inconvenient women were disappeared, their voices silenced, their futures erased. She had heard stories. Women committed by husbands who wanted younger wives, by families who found them too difficult, by society when they challenged conventions too strenuously. Mrs. Pemberton produced a set of papers from her apron. "The doctor is waiting at the house, Mr. Hartwell. Just say the word." Evelyn looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. Whatever love had existed between them had been burned away by his desperation and pride. He would destroy her rather than admit failure. He would lock her away rather than lose face. "You have 10 seconds to return to your room," Marcus said, "or I call Dr. Henderson, and you'll never see daylight again except through barred windows." 10, 9. Evelyn's hand tightened on her valise. Behind her father, beyond the carriage house, the open road beckoned. Miller's station was 2 miles away. She was young, she was desperate, and she had nothing left to lose. 8, 7. She ran. It was graceless and desperate, her skirts tangling around her legs, the valise banging against her hip. Behind her, she heard her father shout, heard footsteps pounding, but she didn't look back. She ran down the lane, past the ornamental gates, onto the rutted road that led to town. "Stop her!" Marcus's voice echoed. "Someone stop that woman!" But the road was empty in the early morning, and Evelyn ran like her life depended on it, because it did. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed protest, but she pushed forward. A mile. Then another. She could see Miller's station ahead, the small depot building where stages stopped. And there, miracle of miracles, was a coach. Not the passenger stage Annie had mentioned, but an earlier one, a freight wagon with space for a few travelers. The driver was checking the harness, preparing to leave. "Wait!" Evelyn gasped, stumbling into the station yard. "Please wait. I need passage west." The driver turned, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth and suspicious eyes. "Stage don't leave for another hour, miss. This here's freight." "Please." Evelyn fumbled with Annie's pouch, pulling out coins with shaking hands. "I can pay. I need to leave now, right now." Something in her face must have convinced him, the desperation perhaps, or the tear tracks on her cheeks. He looked past her, up the road where dust was rising from an approaching horse. "How far west?" he asked. "As far as this will take me." She thrust money at him. Too much, probably, but she didn't care. He pocketed the coins and jerked his head toward the wagon. "Get in the back, under the tarp. Don't make a sound." Evelyn scrambled into the wagon bed, burrowing beneath canvas that smelled of dust and grain. A moment later, the wagon lurched into motion. Through a gap in the tarp, she saw her father's horse thunder into the station yard, saw Marcus dismount and confront the driver. A young woman, dark hair, traveling alone. Did she come through here? No one like that, mister. Just me and freight this morning. You're lying. I'll have you. But the driver had already climbed back onto his seat, and the wagon was rolling away. Evelyn lay in darkness, listening to her father's shouts fade into distance. Every revolution of the wheels carried her farther from the only life she'd known, from comfort and security, from her name and identity. She should have felt terrified. She should have felt lost. Instead, for the first time in her life, Evelyn Hartwell felt free. The wagon rolled westward through Montana territory, carrying her toward an unknown future. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the canvas above her. Gradually, Evelyn's heartbeat slowed, her breathing steadied. She emerged from under the tarp as the miles accumulated, sitting among crates and sacks, watching the landscape transform. The driver, who introduced himself as Gus without offering a last name, said little, but his silence was companionable rather than hostile. Around midday, he stopped to rest the horses and shared his lunch, hard bread, cheese, and an apple. Running from something bad? He asked as they ate. Toward something better, I hope, Evelyn replied. Gus nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Wyoming territory's ahead. Rough country, but honest. You got people waiting? She thought of Annie's cousin Mary, the boarding house in Red Willow. After a fashion, good, woman alone needs people. He studied her thoughtfully. That fancy-dressed man back at Miller's Station, your husband? My father. Ah. Gus spat tobacco juice into the dust. Well, you're old enough to choose your own road. Sometimes family don't understand that. They climbed back into the wagon and continued west. The mountains gradually gave way to rolling plains, the air growing drier. They passed small settlements, isolated ranches, reminders that civilization here was tenuous, temporary. This was territory where people came to start over, to escape, to transform. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, Gus pointed ahead. Red Willow's about 10 miles on. We'll make it by dark. Red Willow? Evelyn sat up straighter. That's where I'm headed, where Annie's cousin lives. Walsh's boarding house? Gus nodded. Mary Walsh runs a decent place. Clean beds, honest rates. She won't ask questions you don't want to answer. The last miles passed in growing darkness, and then they were rolling into Red Willow, if it could even be called a town. A main street of packed dirt, perhaps 20 buildings total, lights glowing in windows. A general store, a saloon, what looked like a blacksmith shop, and there, bearing a hand-painted sign, Walsh's boarding house. Gus helped Evelyn down from the wagon. Good luck, miss. Whatever you're running from or toward, hope you find what you need. She thanked him with what remained of her money except for a few precious dollars, then stood before the boarding house with her valise in hand. Through the window she could see a dining room, people gathered around a table. Normal people, living normal lives. Could she be one of them? Could Evelyn Hartwell, raised in luxury, become someone else entirely? Only one way to find out. She climbed the steps and knocked on the door. A woman answered, late 30s, with Annie's red hair and green eyes, wearing a practical dress and flour-dusted apron. She looked Evelyn up and down with shrewd assessment. Help you? Are you Mary Walsh? Evelyn's voice trembled. I have a letter from your cousin Annie in Montana. Mary's expression shifted from suspicion to cautious interest. Annie? Haven't heard from her in months. Come in then. Let's see this letter. Evelyn stepped across the threshold into warmth and light, into cooking smells and friendly chatter from the dining room. She handed over Annie's letter, watching as Mary read it quickly. Says here you need work and a place to stay, Mary said. Says you're trustworthy and hardworking. Annie wouldn't lie, but I'll need to know. What kind of trouble are you running from? Evelyn met her eyes steadily. The kind where my father tried to force me into marriage with a man I didn't love. The kind where I chose freedom over security. Is that trouble you can live with? Mary was quiet for a long moment, then smiled. Honey, half the women in this territory are running from something. Long as you're willing to work hard and earn your keep, your past is your business. She extended a flour-dusty hand. Welcome to Red Willow, Miss Walsh, Evelyn said, taking the offered hand and feeling the first fragile threads of a new life beginning. Evelyn Walsh. And with that lie that felt more like truth than any reality she'd left behind, her transformation began. The first morning in Red Willow, Evelyn woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of coffee brewing downstairs. Sounds and smells so foreign to her previous life that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. Then she opened her eyes to see the small, plain room Mary had given her. Whitewashed walls, a narrow iron bed, a washstand with a chipped basin, a single window overlooking the dusty main street. No rose wallpaper, no silk curtains, no maid to bring her morning chocolate on a silver tray. She sat up, her body aching from the previous day's desperate flight, and realized she had never been more awake in her life. Mary knocked and entered without waiting for an answer, carrying a simple cotton dress over her arm. Borrowed this from Sarah Hendricks down at the general store. You'll need proper work clothes if you're going to earn your keep. Breakfast is in 10 minutes, and after that, we'll see what you're made of. The dress was brown calico, worn soft from many washings, with buttons up the front and sleeves that could be rolled for hard work. Evelyn had never worn anything so humble, and when she put it on, she barely recognized herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The fine lady was gone. In her place stood someone who might actually belong in this rough settlement. Downstairs, the boarding house dining room was filled with early risers, ranch hands and freight workers, a surveyor passing through, an older woman Mary introduced as Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry service in town. They nodded at Evelyn with friendly curiosity, but didn't press for her story. In Red Willow, it seemed, people's pasts were their own business. Mary set a plate before her, eggs, bacon, thick slices of bread, coffee so strong it made her eyes water. Eat up. You'll need strength for today's work. What kind of work? Evelyn asked, trying not to show how intimidated she felt. Everything. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, serving meals, tending the garden, hauling water. Boarding house runs on hard work from dawn to dusk. Mary poured herself coffee and sat across from Evelyn. Annie's letter said you were raised fine, that you can read and write and speak fancy. But can you work? It was a fair question, and Evelyn answered honestly. I don't know. I've never had to. But I'm willing to learn. Mary studied her with those sharp green eyes, so like Annie's, then nodded. Honesty's a good start. Most girls from fine families who end up out here think the world owes them something. They don't last a week. You prepared to get your hands dirty? Evelyn looked down at her hands, soft, pale, the only callus from holding a pen or piano keys. She thought of her father's threat, of Judge Blackwood's possessive stare, of the asylum cell that had nearly claimed her. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to stay free, she said. Then let's see if you mean it. The next hours were a baptism by fire. Mary put Evelyn to work immediately after breakfast, showing her how to strip beds and wash linens in the big copper tub out back. The water had to be hauled from the well, heated over the fire, and the sheets scrubbed on a washboard until Evelyn's arms trembled with exhaustion. Her hands, unused to such labor, quickly blistered and bled. You can stop if it's too much, Mary said, not unkindly, watching Evelyn struggle with a particularly stubborn stain. No. Evelyn gritted her teeth and kept scrubbing. I won't stop. By noon, every muscle in her body screamed protest. She had scrubbed 6 sets of sheets, peeled 2 buckets of potatoes, swept 3 rooms, and carried enough water to fill a small lake. When Mary called her in for the midday meal, Evelyn collapsed at the table with a groan she couldn't suppress. The ranch hands laughed, not cruelly but with understanding. First day's always the hardest, miss, one of them said. Gets easier, eventually. Or you get stronger, another added. Same difference. After lunch, Mary taught her how to knead bread dough, a skill that required strength Evelyn didn't possess, but developed through sheer determination. Her knuckles grew raw from the board, flour dusted her hair and clothes, and the dough seemed to mock her efforts by refusing to cooperate. You're fighting it, Mary observed. Work with it, not against it. Feel the rhythm. Evelyn tried again, forcing herself to relax, to feel rather than force. Gradually, something shifted. The dough became less adversarial, more responsive. By the time she finished, her arms were jelly, but the loaves waiting to rise looked almost presentable. Not bad for a first try, Mary admitted. You might survive after all. The days blurred together in a haze of hard work and harder lessons. Evelyn learned to make beds with hospital corners, to black the stove until it shined, to pluck chickens and gut fish without flinching. She learned which boarders liked their eggs runny and which preferred them hard, who needed coffee first thing and who wanted tea. She learned to carry heavy trays without dropping them, to darn socks and mend sheets, to keep accounts in Mary's ledger with her careful script. Her hands toughened, calluses forming over the blisters. Her arms grew stronger from hauling water and wood. Her back learned to endure the constant bending and lifting. She fell into bed each night too exhausted to dream and woke each morning to do it all again. But something was changing inside her that went deeper than physical transformation. With each task completed, each challenge met, Evelyn felt herself becoming someone different, someone capable, someone who could survive on her own merit rather than her family name or marriageable status. 2 weeks into her new life, she was hanging laundry in the yard when a group of riders came down the main street. Not the usual ranch hands or freight workers, but men who carried themselves with authority. Her heart seized when she recognized the lead rider, Marshall Davis from Montana Territory, a man who had dined at her father's table more than once. Evelyn ducked behind the hanging sheets, watching through the damp linen as the marshal and his men stopped at the general store. She was too far to hear the conversation, but she saw him showing something to the storekeeper, a paper, perhaps a photograph or a description. Mary appeared at her elbow, following her gaze. "Friends of yours?" "No," Evelyn whispered. "The opposite. My father must have sent them." "Looking for Evelyn Hartwell, daughter of Marcus Hartwell of Montana Territory?" Mary's voice was calm. "Because that marshal came by here 3 days ago with that exact description. I told him I'd never heard the name, which is God's honest truth. I only know an Evelyn Walsh, distant cousin of my own cousin Annie." Evelyn turned to stare at her. "You knew? This whole time?" "I'm not stupid, honey. Girl shows up with a letter from my cousin, running from something, speaking like she swallowed a dictionary, hands softer than a baby's bottom. Didn't take a genius to figure out you were quality folk hiding from trouble." Mary shrugged. "But Annie vouched for you, and you've worked harder than any fine lady I've ever met. Your secrets are your own." "Thank you," Evelyn breathed. "If they find me, they won't find Evelyn Hartwell here. That girl doesn't exist in Red Willow. Just Evelyn Walsh, hardworking boarding house girl." Mary smiled grimly. "But you might want to stay out of sight for a few days, just to be safe." Evelyn spent the next week working mainly inside, away from the windows when strangers passed through town. She heard snippets of conversation from boarders, something about a runaway heiress, a jilted judge, a substantial reward being offered for information. Her hands shook as she served dinner, terrified someone would recognize her despite her changed appearance. But no one did. The fine lady in silk dresses bore no resemblance to the girl in calico with work-roughened hands and sun-touched skin. Evelyn Hartwell had disappeared, and Evelyn Walsh had taken her place so completely that even she sometimes forgot which name was real. After 3 weeks of searching, the marshal and his men rode out of Red Willow, and Evelyn breathed easier. Her father had tried to find her and failed. She had escaped, truly escaped. One morning in early autumn, Mary announced they needed supplies from the Calder Ranch, eggs, butter, and the vegetables the ranch hand's sister grew in her impressive garden. "Usually I go myself, but my knees are acting up with the weather change. Think you can handle the ride out there? It's about 5 miles north." "I can try," Evelyn said, though she hadn't ridden a horse since leaving her father's house, and never without a proper saddle and side saddle at that. Mary provided a gentle mare named Daisy and a canvas bag for supplies. "The Calders are good people. Luke runs the ranch with his sister Sarah since their parents passed a few years back. They're honest. Keep to themselves mostly. Tell them Mary sent you, and they'll treat you fair." The ride through Wyoming Territory was unlike anything Evelyn had experienced during her sheltered life. The land stretched vast and wild, dotted with sage and wildflowers, mountains rising in the distance like promises. The air smelled of grass and earth and freedom. For the first time since fleeing Montana, Evelyn felt something other than fear or exhaustion. She felt alive. The Calder Ranch appeared gradually. First the fences, well-maintained and straight, then the fields where cattle grazed. Finally, the buildings themselves, A sturdy house, a large barn, several outbuildings, all speaking of careful management and hard work. As Evelyn approached, a woman emerged from the garden, shading her eyes against the sun. She was perhaps 30, with brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing men's trousers and a work shirt, a sight that would have scandalized Montana society, but seemed perfectly natural here. Her face was tanned from outdoor work, her hands holding a basket of vegetables. "Can I help you?" she called, friendly but cautious. "I'm from Mary Walsh's boarding house," Evelyn said, dismounting carefully. "She sent me to collect the eggs and butter order?" The woman's face cleared. "Oh, of course. Mary mentioned she might send someone new. I'm Sarah Calder." She set down her basket and approached, extending a dirt-stained hand without embarrassment. "Welcome to our ranch." Evelyn shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that matched her own developing ones. "Evelyn Walsh, pleased to meet you." "Walsh? Any relation to Annie Walsh? Used to work up in Montana territory?" Evelyn's heart skipped. "My cousin," she said carefully. "Distant cousin." Sarah studied her with intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than Evelyn wanted to reveal, but she simply nodded. "Well, any cousin of Annie's is welcome here. She was always kind when she visited Red Willow. Come on up to the house. I'll get your order together, and you can meet my brother if he's around." The ranch house was simple but comfortable, with wide windows and a porch that wrapped around two sides. Inside, everything was clean and orderly, though clearly designed for function rather than fashion. Sarah led Evelyn to the kitchen, where butter and cheese sat cooling in a spring box, and eggs waited in careful rows. "Mary's usual order," Sarah said, packing everything into the canvas bag. "I included some extra squash. We had a good harvest this year. And here," she wrapped several fresh apple turnovers in cloth. "Just made these this morning, for you and Mary." "That's very kind," Evelyn said, surprised by the generosity. "What do I owe you?" "Mary keeps an account. We settle up quarterly." Sarah hesitated, then added, "You're new to Wyoming territory?" "About a month now." "How are you finding it? Must be different from wherever you came from." There was no judgment in the question, just genuine curiosity. Evelyn chose her words carefully. "It's harder than I expected, but better too, in ways I didn't anticipate." Sarah smiled with understanding. "Red Willow's good for people who need a fresh start. Most folks here are running from something or toward something. We don't judge." She paused. "If you're looking for work besides the boarding house, we could use help here a few days a week. My brother and I manage the ranch, but there's always more work than time. Garden needs tending, chickens need care, cooking and cleaning. We'd pay fair wages." Evelyn's immediate instinct was to refuse. She was already overwhelmed with boarding house work. But then she thought of the extra money, the security it would provide, and something about Sarah's straightforward manner, her practical kindness, made Evelyn want to say yes. "I'd have to ask Mary if she could spare me," Evelyn said. "But if she agrees, I'd be interested." "Good. Talk to Mary. Then come by any day you can. We start early, but the work's honest, and..." The kitchen door opened and a man stepped inside, stopping short when he saw Evelyn. He was tall and lean, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of weathered denim. He wore work clothes dusty from the range, and his face was tanned and lined from sun and wind. Not handsome in any conventional sense, but there was something compelling about him. A quiet strength, a steadiness. "Luke, this is Evelyn Walsh from Mary's boarding house," Sarah said. "She's delivered our order. Evelyn, my brother Luke." "Ma'am." Luke touched his hat brim in greeting, his voice low and spare. He had a way of standing that suggested he was more comfortable with horses and open spaces than social niceties, but his eyes were kind. "Mr. Calder," Evelyn replied, feeling unaccountably nervous under that steady gaze. "Luke's fine. We don't stand on formality out here." He moved to the basin to wash his hands, clearly preparing for lunch. "You staying for a meal? Sarah always makes too much." "I should get back to Mary," Evelyn said quickly. "But thank you for the offer." "Another time, then," Sarah said warmly. "And think about that work offer. You'd be welcome here." As Evelyn rode back toward Red Willow, the canvas bag full of supplies, She found herself thinking about the Calder Ranch, the orderly buildings, the well-tended fields, Sarah's friendly competence, and Luke's quiet presence. There had been something peaceful about the place, something that spoke of stability and honest work. Mary approved the additional work arrangement immediately. The Calders are good people, and Lord knows I can spare you a few days a week now that you've learned the routine. Extra money never hurts either. So Evelyn began riding out to the Calder Ranch 3 mornings a week. Sarah put her to work immediately, weeding the expansive garden, collecting eggs, learning to make butter and cheese, helping with the never-ending tasks that kept a working ranch running. The work was different from the boarding house, but equally demanding, and Evelyn attacked it with the same determination she'd shown Mary. Sarah was a patient teacher, showing Evelyn how to identify weeds from vegetables, how to tell which eggs were fresh, how to work butter until it reached the perfect consistency. She talked while they worked, sharing stories of the ranch, of Red Willow, of the territory's rough history. "Luke and I built this place up after our parents died," Sarah said one morning as they worked side by side in the garden. "Cattle fever took them both within a week of each other. We were young. I was 19, Luke was 24. Could have sold the land and gone back east where we had family. But Luke said we should stay, make something of our own. Best decision we ever made." "It must have been hard," Evelyn said, pulling a stubborn thistle. "Everything worth doing is hard, but we had each other, and we had purpose. That's more than a lot of people can say." Sarah glanced at her. "You have siblings, Evelyn?" "No, I was an only child." Well, it was one of the few true things she could say about her past. "Must have been lonely." "Sometimes," Evelyn admitted. "I had friends at school, but after graduation, everyone scattered to their marriages and new lives. I was left alone with my father, and we—" She trailed off, realizing she'd said too much. But Sarah just nodded. Fathers and daughters don't always see eye to eye, especially when the father thinks he knows what's best and the daughter knows different. It was said so matter-of-factly, without prying, that Evelyn felt safe enough to add, "My father wanted to choose my entire future, every detail. Who I'd marry, how I'd live, what I'd become. He never once asked what I wanted." "So you left?" "So I left." Sarah pulled a carrot from the soil, brushing away the dirt. "Brave thing, leaving everything you know. A lot of women talk about it, but you actually did it. That takes strength." "Or desperation," Evelyn said wryly. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Sarah stood, stretching her back. "Come on, let's get these vegetables washed. Luke will want lunch soon, and he gets grumpy when he's hungry." Luke Calder was indeed a man of few words, but Evelyn learned to read the words he didn't say. He communicated through actions, fixing a broken step without being asked, leaving fresh water by the garden when the day was hot, taking the heaviest loads without comment. He treated Evelyn with the same quiet respect he showed everyone, never prying into her past, never making her feel unwelcome. But she noticed things about him too. The way he was gentle with nervous horses and injured cattle, how he paid his ranch hands fairly and on time, even when it meant he went without luxuries. The way he looked at his land each evening as if seeing something precious beyond the grass and sage. One afternoon, a horse got loose from the corral, spooked by something in the brush. Evelyn was collecting eggs when it thundered past, wild-eyed and panicked. Without thinking, she dropped the egg basket and ran after it, using skills she'd learned as a girl when riding was her one freedom. "Easy," she called, keeping her voice calm even as her heart raced. "Easy, girl. Nobody's going to hurt you." The horse, a young mare, barely broken, circled nervously. Evelyn approached slowly, hands outstretched, speaking in low tones. She'd always had a way with horses, one of the few things her father had approved of, because it was considered ladylike to ride well. "That's it. You're just scared, aren't you? Something startled you, but you're safe. Come here, sweetheart." The mare's ears flicked forward, listening. Gradually, she settled, allowing Evelyn to approach. Evelyn caught the trailing rope and stroked the mare's neck, whispering comfort. "Well done." She turned to find Luke watching from a dozen yards away, his expression approving. Most people would have let her run herself out, or tried to corner her and made it worse. "She was just frightened," Evelyn said, feeling self-conscious under his steady gaze. "I've always liked horses. They're honest about what they feel. Unlike people." It wasn't quite a question. Unlike people, Evelyn agreed. Luke walked closer, taking the rope from her. His hand brushed hers briefly, calloused, warm, solid. You ride? I used to. Not since... She gestured vaguely at her current situation. You should ride again. Good for the soul. He paused, then added, We've got horses that need exercising. If you wanted, you could ride out before starting your work. Or after. It was said casually, but something in his eyes suggested it was more than a simple offer. It was an invitation to freedom, to reclaim a piece of herself she'd left behind. I'd like that, Evelyn said softly. Thank you. From that day forward, Evelyn rode each morning before beginning her work at the ranch. Sometimes Sarah joined her and they explored the territory together, Sarah pointing out landmarks and sharing local history. But more often, Luke would appear at the corral, silently saddling 2 horses, and they'd ride out together. They didn't talk much during these rides. Luke wasn't built for idle conversation, but the silence between them was comfortable, companionable. They'd ride for an hour across the open range, watching the sun transform the landscape, breathing air so clean it made her chest ache. And slowly, without planning it, Evelyn began to heal. The terror of her escape faded. Her hands grew strong and capable. Her body adapted to hard work until it became natural rather than torturous. She made friends among the boarding house regulars and the ranch hands. She learned to laugh again, to find joy in simple things, a perfect sunrise, fresh bread from the oven, the satisfaction of work well done. She became Evelyn Walsh so completely that sometimes days would pass without thinking of Evelyn Hartwell. That girl seemed like someone from a dream, someone who had lived behind glass and never truly touched the world. 3 months into her new life, on a crisp October morning, Evelyn was helping Sarah preserve the last of the garden vegetables when a stranger rode into the ranch yard. He was well-dressed, riding a fine horse, the kind of man who stood out in this rough territory. Sarah's welcoming expression faded to wariness. "Can I help you?" she called from the porch. The man dismounted with practiced ease. "I'm looking for the Calder Ranch. I was told in town this is the place." "You found it. What's your business?" "Name's Thomas Whitfield. I'm an attorney, here on behalf of a client looking for someone." He pulled a paper from his saddlebag. "A young woman missing from Montana Territory. Evelyn Hartwell, daughter of Marcus Hartwell. There's a substantial reward for information leading to her return." Evelyn's hands froze on the jar she was holding. Through the window, she could see the man clearly, well-fed, confident, the kind of lawyer her father would hire. He was showing the paper to Sarah, probably a description or even a photograph. "Never heard of her," Sarah said firmly. "We're just a small ranch. Don't get much traffic through here." She might be using a different name. Dark hair, educated speech, about 22 years old, likely working for wages somewhere, probably doing domestic work since she has no other skills. The description was accurate enough to make Evelyn's blood run cold. She set down the jar carefully, willing her hands not to shake. "Could describe half the young women in this territory," Sarah pointed out. "Sorry I can't help you, Mr. Whitfield. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." The lawyer didn't move. "There's a $1,000 reward, Miss Calder. That's a lot of money. Surely if you'd seen someone matching that description, you'd remember?" "I said I can't help you." Sarah's voice went hard. "Now you're trespassing on private property. I'll ask you once more to leave." The kitchen door opened and Luke stepped out onto the porch. He didn't say anything, just stood there with his rifle held loosely in one hand, not threatening, but making a point. Whitfield raised his hands in mock surrender. "No offense meant, just doing my job. If you hear anything, I'm staying at Walsh's boarding house for a few days." He remounted and tipped his hat. "Good day to you both." They watched him ride away, and only when he was out of sight did Sarah turn and walk into the house, finding Evelyn pressed against the wall by the window, white-faced and shaking. "He's staying at Mary's," Evelyn whispered. "He'll see me there. He'll recognize me." "No, he won't," Sarah said with firm conviction. "Because you're not going back to the boarding house for a few days. You're staying here." "I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm telling." Sarah took Evelyn's trembling hands in her own steady ones. "Listen to me. I don't know your whole story, and I don't need to. But I know running, I know fear, and I know that girl your father wants back. That's not who you are anymore. You're Evelyn Walsh, hardworking woman of Wyoming territory, and we protect our own here. Luke appeared in the doorway. Sarah's right. You'll stay in the spare room upstairs until that lawyer leaves town. No arguments. Why? Evelyn asked, tears threatening. Why would you risk this for me? You barely know me. Brother and sister exchanged a look, then Sarah smiled. Because you catch spooked horses with kindness. Because you work harder than anyone I've ever met. Because when Luke brought home that orphaned calf last month, you stayed up 3 nights helping him feed it, even though you were exhausted from double shifts at the boarding house. She squeezed Evelyn's hands. Because you're good people, and good people deserve protection. Simple as that. Evelyn stayed at the Calder Ranch for 5 days, while Thomas Whitfield asked questions around Red Willow. Mary sent word through a ranch hand that the lawyer was thorough, questioning everyone, showing his description of Evelyn Hartwell to anyone who'd look. But the people of Red Willow, as Mary had said, protected their own. No one had seen the fine lady in the description, only Evelyn Walsh, and she wasn't anybody's business but her own. Those 5 days changed something fundamental. Living in the Calder house, Evelyn saw a different way of being, a brother and sister who respected each other as equals, who shared work and decisions, who had built something meaningful through partnership rather than dominance. She saw what family could be when it was based on love rather than obligation. She also saw Luke differently, not just as a quiet rancher, but as a man of deep integrity. He gave her space but made her feel safe. He asked no questions but offered silent support. When she woke from nightmares of her father finding her, of being dragged back to Judge Blackwood, it was Luke's presence in the house, solid, steadfast, that calmed her racing heart. On the morning of the 6th day, Mary's nephew rode out with news. The lawyer had given up and left Red Willow, heading south toward Colorado territory. The search was moving on. You can come home now, the boy reported. Mary says to tell you the coast is clear. But as Evelyn prepared to return to the boarding house, she realized she felt more at home here, in this simple ranch house with its honest people, than she ever had in her father's mansion. She'd found something here, something she couldn't quite name, but knew she didn't want to lose. Thank you, she said to Luke and Sarah as she prepared to mount Daisy for the ride back. For everything, for protecting me, for not asking questions, for being your friends, Sarah finished. That's what this was, Evelyn, friendship, and friends don't abandon each other. Luke stepped forward, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked almost uncomfortable. You're welcome here, he said carefully. Anytime. For any reason. If you ever need... He stopped, cleared his throat. You're always welcome. There was something in his eyes that made Evelyn's breath catch, something that spoke of more than simple hospitality or even friendship. But before she could examine it, he turned away, heading back toward the barn with his characteristic economy of motion. Evelyn rode back to Red Willow with her thoughts in turmoil. She'd come to Wyoming territory running from one form of possession, determined never to belong to anyone again. But what she was feeling toward Luke Calder wasn't possession or obligation or duty. It was something entirely different, something that felt like choice, like partnership, like home. And that terrified her almost as much as her father's pursuit had. Winter came to Wyoming territory with a vengeance, transforming the landscape into something beautiful and brutal. The work at both the boarding house and the ranch continued, made harder by frozen water pumps and snow that had to be cleared before dawn. Evelyn's hands cracked and bled despite the salve Mary provided, and some mornings the cold was so bitter it hurt to breathe. But she had survived her father's wrath, a desperate flight across territory, and the threat of being dragged back to captivity. She could survive winter. What she wasn't prepared for was the way her feelings for Luke Calder had deepened from respect to something far more dangerous. She tried to ignore it, to focus on her work and her hard-won independence. But every time he appeared at the barn to saddle horses for their morning rides, every time his hand steadied her elbow on an icy path, every time his rare smile appeared, her carefully constructed defenses crumbled a little more. It was Sarah who finally confronted her about it, one bitter January afternoon as they worked together in the warm kitchen preparing preserves. "You're in love with my brother," Sarah said without preamble, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. Evelyn nearly dropped the jar she was holding. I, that's not, don't bother denying it. I've watched you two dance around each other for months now. The way you look at him when you think no one's watching, the way he finds excuses to be wherever you're working. Sarah finally glanced up, her expression kind but frank. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Nothing, Evelyn said firmly, focusing intently on sealing the jar. I can't. I won't. Because you're afraid. Because I'm running from a forced marriage. The last thing I should do is rush into feelings for another man. I need to stand on my own, prove I can survive without... She stopped, struggling to articulate what she barely understood herself. Without depending on someone else, Sarah finished. I understand that. But Evelyn, there's a difference between dependency and partnership. You've proven you can survive alone. You've worked harder than anyone I know, built a life from nothing, stood firm when danger came hunting. You don't need a man to validate your strength. She paused, measuring her next words. But that doesn't mean you have to spend your whole life alone to prove a point. Sometimes accepting love isn't weakness. It's just another kind of courage. Before Evelyn could respond, they heard horses in the yard, multiple riders, arriving fast. Sarah moved to the window, her body tensing. That's the Thompson Ranch hands. Something's wrong. They hurried outside to find 3 men dismounting in a rush, their horses lathered despite the cold. Luke emerged from the barn, already reaching for his coat. Fire at the Thompson place, the lead rider gasped. Barn's going up. We need every able body to help save the livestock and keep it from spreading to the house. How bad? Luke asked, already moving toward the horses. Bad enough. Wind's picking up too. Within minutes, Luke had saddled his horse and was gathering supplies. Sarah was right behind him, but he stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. Someone needs to stay here, manage the ranch. Luke, I can help. I know you can, but if this fire spreads with this wind, other ranches might be threatened. Someone needs to coordinate, send warning, organize. His voice was steady but urgent. I need you here. Please. Sarah nodded reluctantly, then turned to Evelyn. Help me get water barrels ready, just in case. And we'll prepare food. They'll need hot meals when they get back. Evelyn watched Luke ride out with the Thompson hands, her heart tight with unnamed fear. Fire was a rancher's nightmare in this dry winter air, made worse by wooden structures and prairie wind. She forced herself to focus on the work at hand, helping Sarah prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, keeping coffee hot and food ready, watching the horizon for signs of smoke or flame. Other ranch hands arrived with updates. The fire was contained but still burning. The Thompson family's entire hay supply was lost. Several horses had been injured in the panic. It would be a long night. Near midnight, Luke finally returned, his face black with soot, his clothes reeking of smoke. He was limping slightly, favoring his left leg, but when Sarah tried to examine it, he waved her off. Just a burn, nothing serious. Thompson's barn is gone, but we saved the house and most of the livestock. He sank into a chair, accepting the coffee Evelyn pressed into his hands. Could have been worse. You're hurt, Evelyn said, kneeling beside his chair despite his protests. Let me at least clean it. Too exhausted to argue, Luke allowed her to roll up his pant leg, revealing a nasty burn along his calf. Evelyn fetched warm water and clean cloth, working as gently as she could while Sarah prepared a poultice. How did this happen? Evelyn asked, carefully cleaning away ash and debris. Burning beam fell while we were getting the horses out. Got pinned for a minute. Luke's voice was matter-of-fact, as if risking his life for someone else's animals was nothing remarkable. Worth it. We saved them all. As Evelyn wrapped his leg with the poultice Sarah provided, she felt his hand come to rest lightly on her shoulder. Whether to steady himself or comfort her, she couldn't tell. But the gesture, so simple and natural, made her throat tight with emotion. You could have been killed, she whispered. But I wasn't. His voice was quiet, meant only for her. I'm fine, Evelyn. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement of feelings neither had voiced. But before either could speak, Sarah cleared her throat diplomatically. You need rest, Luke, and food, both of you, actually. I'll set out something to eat, and then we're all getting some sleep. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to help the Thompsons rebuild. The community rallied around the Thompson family in the days that followed. Ranchers donated hay and lumber, women organized meals, men volunteered labor for the rebuilding. Evelyn worked alongside everyone else, discovering that this rough territory had something her father's society had lacked: genuine solidarity, help given without expectation of repayment or social advantage. It was during this communal effort that she truly understood what she'd found in Wyoming. These people might be rough-spoken and plainly dressed, but they looked after each other with a loyalty her father's wealthy friends had never shown. There was honor here, and integrity, and a kind of love that had nothing to do with bloodlines or social position. But peace was not meant to last. On a gray March morning, as winter finally began to release its grip on the territory, Evelyn was serving breakfast at the boarding house when a stranger walked in. He was well-dressed but trail-worn, with calculating eyes that swept the room with professional assessment. Her hands went cold on the coffee pot she was holding. "Morning," the man said pleasantly, taking a seat at the counter. "Breakfast and information, if you have both to spare." Mary appeared from the kitchen, her expression neutral. "Breakfast we have. Information depends on what you're asking." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for someone. A young woman who went missing from Montana territory last year. Evelyn Hartwell. I have reason to believe she might have passed through this area." "That lawyer already came through here months ago," Mary said evenly. "We couldn't help him either." "I'm not a lawyer, ma'am. I'm a private investigator hired by Judge Cornelius Blackwood himself. The judge is quite motivated to find his fiancée." The man pulled out a photograph, and Evelyn's heart stopped. It was her, taken at a society function 2 years ago, wearing silk and jewels and looking every inch the pampered heiress. Mary barely glanced at it. "Pretty girl. Haven't seen her. Now, do you want breakfast or not?" The investigator's smile widened. "I'll take breakfast, and I'll be staying a few days asking around. Someone must have seen something. People don't just vanish." Evelyn forced herself to finish her rounds, serving other diners with hands that wanted to shake. When she finally escaped to the kitchen, Mary followed her. "He's not like the lawyer," Mary said quietly. "He's not going to give up after a few questions. Men like that, they're patient. They watch. They wait." "What should I do?" Evelyn whispered. "For now, nothing. Keep your head down. Do your work." "But Evelyn," Mary's expression was grave, "you might need to run again. Be prepared for that." The investigator stayed at the boarding house for 3 days, and Evelyn lived in constant terror. She kept to the kitchen as much as possible, avoided serving his table, made herself invisible. But she could feel his eyes on her sometimes, assessing, calculating. He questioned everyone in town, showed that damning photograph, offered money for information. On the 4th morning, he cornered her in the hallway outside the kitchen. "Excuse me, miss. Could you tell me how to get to the Calder Ranch? I heard they hire help sometimes. Thought the young woman I'm looking for might have found work there." Evelyn kept her eyes down, letting her Wyoming territory accent thicken. "North Road about 5 miles, can't miss it." She started to move past him, but he shifted, blocking her path. "Funny thing," he said conversationally. "You remind me of someone. Can't quite place it. What did you say your name was?" "Didn't say." "Excuse me, I have work to do." "Of course, though I could swear I've seen you before." "You ever been to Montana territory, miss?" "Walsh, Evelyn Walsh. And no, sir, born and raised in Wyoming. Now please, I need to get to the kitchen." He let her pass, but she felt his gaze following her like a physical weight. That evening, she slipped a note to one of the ranch hands heading to the Calder place. "The investigator is coming to your ranch tomorrow. He's asking about me. Be careful." The next morning, unable to bear the waiting, Evelyn made an excuse to Mary about needing to collect eggs from the ranch and rode out early. She arrived to find Luke and Sarah already preparing, having received her warning. "He came by an hour ago," Sarah said grimly, asking questions, showing that photograph. "We told him we'd never seen her, but he didn't believe us, said he'd be back." "I'm sorry," Evelyn said, feeling guilt crush her. "I've brought danger to your door. I should leave, disappear before—" "You're not going anywhere," Luke interrupted, his voice harder than she'd ever heard it. "Not alone." "Luke's right," Sarah agreed. "This man is different. He's not just asking questions, he's hunting, and he's getting close. We need a plan." They spent the morning discussing options, each more desperate than the last. Evelyn could head deeper into the territory, but where? She could try to reach California, but the journey was dangerous and expensive. She could change her appearance more drastically, but the investigator had already seen her, and she was a terrible liar. "There's another option," Luke said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "One that would end this permanently." "What option?" Evelyn asked. Luke met her eyes steadily. "Marriage. If you marry me, you become Evelyn Calder. Your father's claim on you ends. You're legally under your husband's protection, not your father's authority. Judge Blackwood can't force a married woman to honor an engagement to someone else." The kitchen went silent. Sarah looked between her brother and Evelyn, her expression unreadable. Evelyn felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. "Luke," she whispered, you don't have to sacrifice yourself to—" "It's not a sacrifice." He stood, moving closer but maintaining respectful distance. "I'm not proposing out of pity or duty, Evelyn. I'm proposing because I want to. Because over these months, you've become—" He struggled for words, this man who lived in silence more than speech. "You've become essential, like air, like water. I didn't plan it, didn't expect it. But somewhere between teaching you to gentle horses and watching you work until your hands bled rather than give up, I fell in love with you." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "You barely know me, the real me. Everything I've told you is who you are now, who you've chosen to be. I don't care about Evelyn Hartwell from Montana Territory. I know Evelyn Walsh from Red Willow, and she's the strongest, most determined woman I've ever met." Luke took a careful step closer. "But I won't force this, won't push. If you'd rather run, I'll help you. If you'd rather face this alone, I'll respect that. But if you're willing, if you think you could maybe love me someday, then marry me. Not because you're trapped, but because you choose to." "Luke," Sarah said gently, "perhaps Evelyn needs time to think about—" "No." Evelyn wiped her eyes, straightening her shoulders. "No, I don't need time. I need to be honest about everything. If you're offering this, you deserve the truth first." And so, there in the Calder kitchen with winter sunlight streaming through the windows, Evelyn told them everything. About her mother's death and her father's desperation. About Judge Blackwood's possessive interest and the bride price that reduced her to property. About the asylum threat and her desperate flight. About Annie's sacrifice and the fear that had driven every decision since. "My real name is Evelyn Hartwell," she finished, her voice breaking. "My father is Marcus Hartwell, and he did try to sell me to save his fortune. And I ran because I'd rather die free than live as someone's possession. But in running, I've endangered everyone who helped me. Mary, Annie, both of you. And now this investigator is close, and my father won't stop. And Judge Blackwood—" She took a shaking breath. "He's powerful and vindictive, and if he finds me, he'll make everyone who helped me pay for it." Luke listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said simply, "Your father's a coward, and Judge Blackwood is a predator. Neither of them deserve you." "You don't understand," Evelyn said desperately. "They have influence, connections. They could make your life hell, destroy your ranch, bring legal trouble. Let them try." Luke's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "This is Wyoming territory, not Montana. We have different laws here, different judges. And more importantly, we have something your father and that judge will never understand. We protect our own." "But why?" Evelyn asked, tears streaming freely now. "Why would you risk everything for me?" "Because I love you," Luke said, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. "Because you deserve to be free. Because when I imagine my future, you're in it, working beside me, building something together, laughing at the dinner table, growing old on this land." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "Because you're already home, Evelyn. You just haven't realized it yet." Sarah cleared her throat, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "For what it's worth, I think you two are perfect for each other. Stubborn, hardworking, and too noble for your own good. But Luke's right. Marriage would protect you legally. And more than that, it would be true. Anyone who's watched you together can see it." Evelyn looked between them. These two people who had given her sanctuary and friendship and now offered something far more precious, family, freely chosen. She thought of her father's mansion, cold and loveless despite its grandeur. She thought of Judge Blackwood's calculating possessiveness. Then she thought of Luke's quiet strength, his integrity, the way he made her feel safe without making her feel small. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of you, of myself. What if I'm too damaged? What if I can't be the wife you deserve? What if we figure it out together?" Luke suggested, the hint of a smile touching his lips. "What if we build something new, something neither of us has seen before? A partnership, not a possession. A choice, not a cage." "I do love you," Evelyn whispered, finally admitting what she'd been denying for months. "I tried not to, tried to stay independent, prove I didn't need anyone. But Luke, I fell in love with your kindness, your strength, the way you see me as I am, instead of what I should be." "Then marry me," Luke said again. "Not because you're running from something, but because you're running toward something, toward us." Before Evelyn could answer, the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. They rushed to the window to see the investigator riding into the yard, accompanied by two rough-looking men. He dismounted with confident purpose, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Calder," he called. "I know she's here. I saw her ride out this morning. Send out Evelyn Hartwell, and there won't be trouble." Luke moved toward the door, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Wait. If you confront him, there could be violence. We need to be smart about this." "He's right, though," Evelyn said, her voice steadying as she made her decision. "I am here, and I won't let you fight my battles for me." She started toward the door, but Luke blocked her path. "No. Luke, I have to face this. If I hide, he'll keep coming back, keep threatening you and Sarah. But if you go out there, he'll take you, by force if necessary." Luke's jaw was set. "That's not happening." "Then what do you suggest?" Evelyn demanded, fear making her sharp. "We can't hide in here forever. He has men with him. He has guns. He probably has legal papers. What's our play?" Sarah moved to the small desk in the corner, pulling out paper and ink. "Our play is we call his bluff. Luke, where's your Bible?" "What are you thinking?" Luke asked, even as he retrieved the worn Bible from the shelf. "I'm thinking we remove his leverage." "Calder," Sarah called through the window. "We'll be out in 10 minutes. Have patience." She turned to Evelyn and Luke, speaking quickly. "In Wyoming territory, any official can perform a marriage ceremony. Judge, justice of the peace, even a postmaster. But in emergencies, a marriage can be solemnized by simple declaration before witnesses, recorded in a family Bible. It's not fancy, but it's legal." "You want us to marry right now?" Evelyn asked, her mind reeling. "I want you to marry before you walk out that door. Because once you're married, you're not Evelyn Hartwell anymore. You're Evelyn Calder, legal wife of Luke Calder, and your father's authority is void. The investigator can't touch you without your husband's permission, and kidnapping a married woman is a federal offense." Luke looked at Evelyn, his expression intense. "It's fast. Maybe too fast. But Sarah's right. It's legal protection. However, I won't force this. If you'd rather face him another way—" "No." Evelyn straightened her shoulders, feeling clarity wash over her. "No, Sarah's right. But Luke, I need you to understand. I'm not agreeing to this just for protection. I'm agreeing because I love you. Because I want this. Because when I imagine my future, I can't imagine it without you in it." Luke's face transformed, years of loneliness and quiet hope giving way to something like joy. "Then let's make it official." Sarah wrote quickly in the Bible's marriage record. "On this 17th day of March, 1878, Lucas James Calder and Evelyn Rose Hartwell were joined in marriage, witnessed by Sarah Margaret Calder." She looked up. "Now you need to make your vows. Doesn't have to be fancy, just has to be true." Luke took Evelyn's hands in his, and despite the danger waiting outside, despite the fear and uncertainty, his grip was steady. "I, Lucas Calder, take you, Evelyn, as my wife. I promise to protect you, respect you, and stand beside you as an equal partner. I promise to let you be free while giving you a place to belong. I promise to love you, not as property, but as the woman I choose to build a life with." Evelyn's voice shook, but her words were clear. I, Evelyn Hartwell, take you, Lucas Calder, as my husband. I promise to stand beside you, work with you, and build something new together. I promise to trust you with my heart while keeping my strength. I promise to love you freely, because that's the only kind of love worth having. Then by the power vested in me as witness and sister, Sarah said, smiling through tears, I declare you husband and wife. Luke, kiss your bride before that man outside loses patience. Luke pulled Evelyn close and kissed her. Not a tentative first kiss, but a claiming, a promise, a beginning. When they broke apart, Evelyn felt transformed. She was no longer a runaway heiress or a desperate fugitive. She was Evelyn Calder, married woman of Wyoming territory, and no one could take that away. Ready? Luke asked, his arm around her waist. Ready, Evelyn confirmed. They walked out together, Luke slightly ahead, protective but not controlling. The investigator straightened when he saw them, his expression triumphant. Miss Hartwell, your father's been very worried about you. If you'll come with me peacefully, we can— That's Mrs. Calder, Luke interrupted, his voice carrying across the yard. And my wife isn't going anywhere. The investigator's confidence faltered. Wife? No, that's not— You can't just— We were married 10 minutes ago, Sarah said, emerging with the Bible held open to the marriage record. Properly witnessed and recorded. Evelyn Hartwell no longer exists. There's only Evelyn Calder, and she's under her husband's protection now. That's a lie! The investigator took a step forward, hand moving toward his gun. A desperate trick to— It's legal and binding, Luke said flatly. And if you or your men make any move to take my wife by force, I'll defend my property. We've got ranch hands within shouting distance, and they're loyal. You want to test how many guns we can bring to bear? As if summoned, 2 of Luke's ranch hands appeared from the barn, rifles held casually but ready. The investigators' hired men shifted nervously, suddenly less confident in their numbers. Judge Blackwood won't accept this, the investigator warned. He'll fight it in court. He'll what? Claim a woman who's legally married should honor an engagement to him? What court would support that? Sarah's voice was scathing. Tell the judge and Mr. Hartwell that Evelyn made her choice. She chose freedom, love, and a man who sees her as a partner rather than property. They lost. It's over. The investigator stared at them for a long moment, clearly calculating his options. Finally, he turned to his horse. This isn't over. I'll report to my employers. They may have legal recourse. Let them try, Luke said evenly. In the meantime, you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave before I exercise my right to remove you by force. They watched the 3 men ride away, tension holding everyone frozen until they disappeared from sight. Only then did Evelyn realize she was shaking, adrenaline and relief and shock all hitting at once. Is it really over? She whispered. The immediate danger, yes, Sarah said. But Luke's right. Your father might try legal action. We should prepare for that possibility. Let him try, Luke said, pulling Evelyn close. We have law on our side now, and more importantly, we have truth. You chose this, Evelyn. You chose me, chose this life. No court can force you back to a man you never agreed to marry in the first place. Evelyn buried her face in Luke's shoulder, feeling the solidity of him, the reality of what they'd just done. She was married to a good man who loved her, who had offered her freedom and partnership instead of possession and control. I'm sorry it happened so fast, Luke murmured into her hair. Sorry you didn't get a real wedding, with a dress and flowers and time to prepare. Evelyn pulled back to look at him, tears on her cheeks but a smile on her lips. I got exactly the wedding I needed. No performance for society, no negotiations between families, just 2 people choosing each other, witnessed by someone who loves us both. That's more real than any elaborate ceremony could ever be. Sarah hugged them both. Welcome to the family, sister. Now let's get inside and figure out our next steps. Because you're right that the danger isn't completely over. We need to be prepared. As they walked back into the house, this house that was now Evelyn's home by right, as well as feeling, she felt the last chains of her old life falling away. She was no longer running from something. She was running toward it, toward a future built on choice, toward a partnership of equals, toward love that freed rather than imprisoned. The investigator would report back. Her father and Judge Blackwood would rage. There might be legal battles ahead, challenges and complications. But for the first time since fleeing Montana, Evelyn wasn't afraid. She was no longer alone. She was Evelyn Calder, and she was home. The reality of what they'd done settled over the household like fresh snow, beautiful but requiring careful navigation. That evening, as Sarah tactfully excused herself to stay with Mary at the boarding house for a few days, Evelyn and Luke found themselves alone in the ranch house for the first time as husband and wife. The awkwardness was palpable. Two people who'd married in haste now facing the intimate reality of their choice. Luke stood by the fireplace, stoking the flames with more attention than necessary. "I'll take the spare room," he said without looking at her. "Until you're ready. Until this feels real and not just a legal protection." Evelyn's heart swelled at his consideration, at the respect embedded in every word. She crossed the room and placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Luke, look at me." He straightened, turning to face her, and she saw vulnerability in his eyes. This strong, steady man suddenly uncertain. "I meant what I said today," Evelyn told him firmly. "I didn't marry you just for protection. I married you because I love you, because I choose you, and I don't want you sleeping in the spare room like we're strangers playing house." She took a breath, feeling her cheeks warm but refusing to look away. "I want a real marriage. With you, starting now." Luke searched her face as if verifying the truth of her words. Then, slowly, carefully, he cupped her cheek with one calloused hand. "I've never done this before," he admitted quietly. "Never courted anyone, never thought much about marriage. Figured I'd spend my life alone on this ranch, and that would be enough. But then you showed up, all stubborn determination and soft hands that refused to quit, and suddenly alone wasn't enough anymore." "I've never done this either," Evelyn confessed. "I was raised to be ornamental, not intimate. To manage a household but never truly share it. Everything I know about marriage came from watching my parents, and that's not a model I want to follow." "Then we'll figure it out together. Make our own model." Luke leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "No possession, no control, just partnership." "Just partnership," Evelyn echoed, and when he kissed her this time, there was no audience, no urgency, just two people learning each other with tenderness and time. The next few weeks passed in a strange mixture of domestic tranquility and underlying tension. Evelyn moved her few possessions from the boarding house to the ranch, transforming the spare bedroom into her own space while sharing Luke's. She learned the rhythms of ranch life as a wife rather than an employee, waking before dawn to make breakfast, managing the household while Luke worked the land, sitting together in the evenings going over accounts and making plans. Mary had been delighted by the marriage, hugging Evelyn fiercely and whispering, "Your cousin Annie would be so proud. You found your freedom and your home." Sarah returned after a week, settling back into the ranch with easy grace, treating Evelyn not as an interloper, but as the sister she'd never had. But the shadow of Montana territory still loomed. 3 weeks after the investigator left, a letter arrived bearing official seals, legal documents from Marcus Hartwell's attorney claiming the marriage was invalid due to coercion and mental incompetence, demanding Evelyn's return to her father's custody for proper medical evaluation. Luke read the documents with a face like granite, then threw them in the fire. "Let them come. They have no jurisdiction here." "They have money," Evelyn said, fear creeping back despite the safety of Luke's presence. "Money buys influence, Luke. Judges, lawmen, even territorial officials. My father won't just give up." "Neither will we." Sarah entered the kitchen with a telegram in hand. "This just came from the Red Willow Telegraph office. It's from someone named Annie Walsh in Montana Territory. She says to warn you that Judge Blackwood is spreading rumors that you were kidnapped, possibly by criminals operating in Wyoming. He's petitioning the territorial marshal to investigate." Evelyn sank into a chair, the weight of her old life pressing down on her fragile new happiness. "He's trying to paint Luke as a criminal, make it look like I was taken against my will." "Were you?" Luke asked quietly, kneeling beside her chair. "Taken against your will?" "You know I wasn't." "Then we have witnesses who can testify to that. Mary, Sarah, the ranch hands, half of Red Willow. We have the marriage record witnessed and dated before that investigator arrived. We have your own voice, Evelyn. You can testify that you chose this freely." "But will anyone listen?" Evelyn's voice broke. I'm a woman, Luke. A woman who defied her father and rejected an important man's proposal. Society doesn't reward that. They'll call me hysterical, mentally unsound, seduced by frontier roughness. They'll paint you as a predator and me as a victim who doesn't know her own mind. Sarah set down the telegram and pulled out a chair, her expression thoughtful. Then we need to control the narrative before they do. We need statements from everyone who knows you, documenting that you came here of your own volition, worked hard, made your own decisions. We need legal representation, someone who can argue Wyoming's jurisdiction and your right to self-determination. That costs money, Luke said. Money we don't have much of. But we have community. Sarah tapped the table decisively. Every rancher who's benefited from your help, every person in Red Willow who knows your character. We don't fight this alone. We fight it together. Over the next few days, they mounted their defense with the help of neighbors, who rallied without hesitation. Mary wrote a detailed statement about Evelyn's arrival and employment. The Thompsons, whose barn Evelyn had helped rebuild, provided testimony about her character and work ethic. Even the gruff freight driver Gus appeared, offering to swear that he'd transported Evelyn voluntarily, that she'd been running from something but running toward freedom, not kidnapping. The community lawyer in Red Willow, a sharp woman named Clara Donovan, who'd come west after being denied entry to Eastern law societies, agreed to represent them. She reviewed their case with the thoroughness of someone who'd fought her own battles against society's expectations. Your marriage is legal and binding, Clara confirmed, sitting at the Calder kitchen table with documents spread before her. Wyoming territory has clear laws on this. Once you married, your father's authority ended. However, they're going to argue three things: coercion, mental incompetence, and lack of proper waiting period. I wasn't coerced, Evelyn said firmly. I chose Luke freely. I believe you, but they'll say the threat of being caught by the investigator constituted duress, that you married in panic rather than genuine desire. Clara looked at her seriously. We need to prove your relationship existed before that day, that this wasn't a sudden desperate act, but the culmination of growing affection. Luke and Evelyn exchanged glances. We rode together most mornings, Luke offered, for months, starting back in October. I helped at the ranch 3 days a week since September, Evelyn added. Multiple witnesses can confirm we spent significant time together. Good. I'll collect testimony establishing your courtship, such as it was. Clara made notes. What about the mental competence claim? That's ridiculous, Sarah interjected. Evelyn manages household accounts, reads and writes better than most, works harder than anyone I know. There's nothing incompetent about her. Again, I agree. But Judge Blackwood is claiming that any woman who would reject his proposal and choose frontier poverty must be mentally unsound. It's condescending and insulting, but it's also a common legal strategy used against women who defy expectations. Clara fixed Evelyn with a steady gaze. Are you prepared to testify? To stand in front of officials, possibly including men sympathetic to your father's position, and defend your choices? Evelyn thought of the girl she'd been a year ago, sheltered, voiceless, trained to defer and comply. Then she thought of everything she'd survived since, the desperate flight, the backbreaking work, the terror of being hunted. She thought of the calluses on her hands and the strength in her back and the love in her heart. I'm prepared, she said. I'll tell the truth. I'll make them hear me. Then we fight. Clara gathered her papers. I'll file a formal response to their claims and request a hearing here in Wyoming territory. We have home advantage, our judges, our community, our laws. But be prepared, Evelyn. They may send more investigators, more legal challenges. Your father sounds like a man who doesn't accept defeat. After Clara left, Luke found Evelyn standing on the porch, staring out at the land she'd come to love. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders. The evening air was cold, spring still struggling to establish itself. Having regrets? He asked softly. About marrying you? Never. She leaned back against his chest. About bringing this trouble to your door? Every day. Our door, Luke corrected. This is your home now, Evelyn. Your ranch as much as mine. And whatever trouble comes, we face it together. That's what partnership means. She turned in his arms, looking up at this man who'd offered her everything without asking for anything in return. How did you get so wise? Lots of time alone with horses and sky. They teach you what matters. He kissed her forehead. You matter, Evelyn. More than peace, more than ease. You're worth fighting for. The hearing was scheduled for late April in Red Willow's small courthouse, presided over by Judge Morrison, a stern but fair man who'd built his reputation on upholding territorial law rather than bending to Eastern influence. Marcus Hartwell sent his attorney, a polished man named Reginald Marsh, who looked distinctly uncomfortable in frontier Wyoming. Judge Blackwood himself did not appear, but his presence loomed through the legal documents claiming his damaged reputation and right to his fiancée. Clara Donovan opened with a strong defense, laying out the timeline of Evelyn's arrival in Wyoming, her employment, her courtship with Luke, and her voluntary marriage. She called witnesses in succession, Mary Walsh testifying about Evelyn's determination and independence, Sarah describing her brother's growing affection and Evelyn's reciprocation, ranch hands confirming the couple's obvious mutual regard. Reginald Marsh cross-examined aggressively, trying to paint Evelyn as a confused girl who'd fled a moment of premarital nerves only to fall prey to opportunistic frontiermen. But his Eastern condescension worked against him. When he suggested that no rational woman would choose rustic poverty over civilized comfort, Judge Morrison's expression soured. "Mr. Marsh," the judge interrupted, "are you suggesting that every woman in Wyoming territory who chose to settle here over remaining in the East is mentally incompetent?" Marsh backpedaled, but the damage was done. The courtroom, packed with Red Willow residents, murmured disapproval. Then Clara called Evelyn to testify. As she walked to the stand, her hand brushed Luke's shoulder, drawing strength from his solid presence. She wore a simple blue dress Sarah had made, her hair braided simply, her hands showing the honest wear of work. She looked nothing like the society girl in the photograph Marsh kept waving around, and that was precisely the point. Clara led her through the story gently. Her mother's death, her father's increasing desperation, Judge Blackwood's unwanted attention, the threat of forced marriage or asylum commitment. "Why didn't you simply refuse the judge's proposal?" Marsh interrupted. "Why run away?" Evelyn met his eyes steadily. "Because I did refuse multiple times, but my father had already accepted a bride price. I was sold, Mr. Marsh, like livestock. And when I protested, my father threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to the territorial asylum. I ran because staying meant losing my freedom entirely, either to forced marriage or institutionalization." "A dramatic claim," Marsh said dismissively. "Do you have proof of this alleged threat?" The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, was present. She had the commitment papers ready, and my father himself said the words to me. "You have 10 seconds to return to your room, or I call Dr. Henderson, and you'll never see daylight again except through barred windows." Evelyn's voice remained steady even as her hands trembled. "Those aren't words you forget, Mr. Marsh. And yet you expect this court to believe that a respected silver tycoon would threaten his own daughter. I expect this court to believe the truth. My father isn't evil, Mr. Marsh. He's desperate. His fortune collapsed, and he saw me as his only remaining asset. He would have sacrificed my entire life to restore his social position. That's not love. That's not protection. That's possession." Clara stepped forward. Mrs. Calder, can you describe your state of mind when you married Lucas Calder?" "I was clear-headed and certain," Evelyn said firmly. "Yes, there was an investigator outside threatening to take me. Yes, the marriage happened quickly. But I'd already been falling in love with Luke for months. He was kind without being controlling, strong without being domineering. He saw me as a person, not a prize. When he proposed, it wasn't to possess me. It was to protect me while letting me remain free. That's the difference Mr. Marsh and Judge Blackwood will never understand. Real love doesn't cage. It liberates." The courtroom was silent. Even Marsh seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Then he rallied, his tone becoming sharp. "You claim to love Mr. Calder. Yet you'd known him only a few months. You worked at his ranch for wages. How do we know this isn't simply opportunism? A desperate woman trading her body for security?" Luke shot to his feet, fury in his eyes, but Judge Morrison's gavel cracked down. "Mr. Marsh, you will refrain from such offensive insinuations, or I will hold you in contempt. This is a courtroom, not a saloon brawl." "I apologize, Your Honor," Marsh said, not sounding apologetic at all. "But the question of motive is relevant." "I'll answer," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Yes, I was desperate when I arrived in Wyoming, desperate for freedom, for independence, for the chance to prove I could survive on my own merit. I worked myself to exhaustion learning skills I'd never needed before. I earned every penny I was paid. And yes, I came to love Luke during those months, but I didn't marry him for security, Mr. Marsh. I had security working for Mary Walsh. I had a community that protected me. I married Luke because he offered me partnership. Because when I imagined my future, I couldn't imagine it without him. Is that opportunism? Or is that simply how love works when it's real? Clara let the words hang in the air before asking her final question. Mrs. Calder, if this court somehow ruled your marriage invalid, if you were forced to return to Montana, what would you do? Evelyn looked directly at Judge Morrison. I would run again. I would keep running until I found some place where a woman's voice matters as much as her father's, where consent means something, where I'm recognized as a human being with rights rather than property to be traded between men. She paused. But I hope Wyoming Territory is better than that. I hope this is a place where justice isn't just for men, where a woman's freely given testimony counts for something. Because if it's not, then everything I've heard about the frontier being a place of new beginnings is a lie. Judge Morrison studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Marsh. Does the petitioner have any other witnesses? Your Honor, we had hoped to bring Miss Hartwell's father, Mrs. Calder, the judge corrected sharply. And Mr. Hartwell chose not to appear, I note. Chose to send lawyers rather than face his daughter directly. That speaks volumes, Mr. Marsh. Mr. Hartwell's business affairs prevented his travel, Your Honor, but he has provided written testimony, which I've read. Self-serving claims of concern that sound more like wounded pride to my ear. Judge Morrison straightened his papers. I've heard enough. I'll render my decision tomorrow morning. Court adjourned. That night, Evelyn barely slept. She lay in Luke's arms, listening to his steady heartbeat, trying to memorize the feel of safety in case tomorrow ripped it away. Luke stroked her hair, silent but present, his strength a bulwark against her fear. Whatever happens, he murmured into the darkness, we'll face it. If we have to run, we run together. If we have to fight harder, we fight. But Evelyn, I meant every vow. You're my wife, my partner, my choice. Nothing a judge says can change that. I'm so tired of fighting, she whispered, so tired of being afraid. I know, and I wish I could promise it's over, but tomorrow might bring an end to this chapter, at least. We'll know where we stand. Morning came too quickly and too slowly. The courthouse was even more crowded than the day before, word having spread through the territory about the case. Evelyn saw faces she recognized, ranchers, merchants, even some women who'd made similar choices to hers, fleeing constraint for frontier freedom. Judge Morrison entered with grave formality, and the room fell silent. He didn't sit, remaining standing behind his bench as he spoke. This court has reviewed the evidence and testimony presented regarding the marriage of Lucas Calder and Evelyn Hartwell, now Evelyn Calder. The petitioners claim this marriage is invalid due to coercion, mental incompetence, and irregular procedure. I will address each claim in turn. Evelyn felt Luke's hand find hers, their fingers interlacing. First, coercion. The evidence shows that while external pressure existed in the form of an investigator seeking Mrs. Calder's return, the marriage itself was proposed as one option among many. Mr. Calder explicitly stated Mrs. Calder was free to refuse and choose another path. Multiple witnesses confirm an existing relationship of several months' duration. The marriage, while hastened by circumstance, was not coerced. This claim is without merit. Marsh's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Second, mental incompetence. I find this claim not only without merit, but offensive. Mrs. Calder demonstrated clear reasoning, articulate expression, and sound judgment throughout her testimony. The suggestion that any woman who defies her father's wishes must be mentally unsound is a legal theory this court rejects entirely. Women are not children, gentlemen. They are rational beings capable of self-determination. A ripple of approval moved through the courtroom. Evelyn's grip on Luke's hand tightened. Third, irregular procedure. Wyoming Territory law allows for simplified marriage solemnization in circumstances of necessity. The marriage was properly witnessed, recorded in the family Bible as is customary, and later registered with territorial authorities. The procedure, while expedited, was legal. Judge Morrison paused, his gaze moving to Marsh. Mr. Marsh, I understand you represent powerful interests, but this is Wyoming Territory, not Montana. Here we recognize that the frontier demands different social structures. Women work alongside men, own property, make decisions. We're even considering women's suffrage, for God's sake. The notion that we should enforce Eastern social restrictions on a woman who freely chose frontier independence is absurd. He turned to Evelyn and Luke. Mrs. Calder, this court finds your marriage legal and binding. You're under no obligation to return to your father's custody or to honor any previous arrangements made without your consent. You are a married woman with full legal rights under Wyoming Territory law. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Evelyn felt tears streaming down her face as Luke pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he'd never let go. Sarah was crying too, hugging them both. Mary pushed through the crowd to embrace Evelyn, whispering, "You did it. You're free." Marsh gathered his papers with visible frustration. "Your Honor, we will appeal this decision to the Territorial Supreme Court. Judge Blackwood will not accept." "Judge Blackwood is welcome to appeal," Morrison said dryly. "But he'll find no more sympathy there than here. Mrs. Calder made her choice freely and legally. This matter is closed. Good day, Mr. Marsh." As the crowd celebrated around them, Evelyn pulled back to look at Luke, this man who'd given her everything by asking for nothing. "We won," she whispered, almost unable to believe it. "No," Luke corrected gently, brushing tears from her cheeks. "You won. You stood up, told your truth, claimed your rights. I just stood beside you." "That's all I ever needed," Evelyn said. "Someone to stand beside me, not in front of me. Someone who sees me as an equal." Clara Donovan approached, her professional composure cracked by a genuine smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Calder. That was one hell of a testimony. You should be proud." "Thank you for fighting for me," Evelyn said, "for taking my case when most lawyers would have dismissed you as a hysterical runaway." Clara's smile turned wry. "I know what it's like to be told you can't do something simply because of your gender. Women like us have to stick together, fight for each other. Otherwise, nothing ever changes." They walked out of the courthouse into brilliant April sunshine. The kind that promised winter was finally loosening its grip. The mountains stood eternal in the distance. The prairie stretched vast and welcoming, and Evelyn felt as if she could finally breathe fully for the first time in a year. "What now?" Sarah asked, practical even in celebration. "Do we worry about appeals? More legal action?" "Let them appeal," Luke said firmly. "We'll face whatever comes. But for now, we celebrate. We've got a ranch to run, crops to plant, and a life to build. That's what matters." They returned to the ranch that evening to find the community had prepared a surprise, a genuine wedding celebration. Tables had been set up in the yard, food contributed by every family in the area, fiddle music playing, people dancing and laughing under strings of lanterns. It was nothing like the society wedding Evelyn might have had in Montana, with formal protocols and political maneuvering. This was real celebration, genuine joy from people who'd fought alongside them. Mary presented them with a quilt she'd been secretly sewing, each square contributed by a different woman in red willow, stitched together into a pattern of community and support. The Thompsons brought a rocking chair they'd crafted from lumber saved from their barn fire. Even Gus, the freight driver, appeared with a bottle of whiskey and a gruff congratulations. As the evening deepened and the celebration continued around them, Luke led Evelyn away from the crowd to the quiet space behind the barn where they'd often talked during her months of work there. The stars were emerging, brilliant in the clear Wyoming sky. "Do you miss it?" Luke asked quietly. "The life you left behind? The comfort, the culture, the refinement?" Evelyn considered the question honestly. She thought of silk dresses and formal dinners, of piano concerts and literary discussions, of servants and leisure, and all the trappings of her former existence. "Sometimes I miss my mother," she admitted. "Miss what could have been if she'd lived, if she'd been strong enough to choose differently. But miss that life? No, It was beautiful prison, Luke, comfortable chains, and I'd rather have calloused hands in freedom than soft hands in captivity. Your hands aren't that calloused anymore, Luke observed, taking one of her hands in his and examining it with gentle attention. You've gotten better at the work. Tougher. Everything about me is tougher now. Stronger. She smiled up at him. You did that. You and Sarah and Mary and this whole territory. You showed me I could survive. More than survive. I could thrive. You did that yourself, Luke corrected. We just gave you the space to discover it. They stood together in comfortable silence, listening to music and laughter drifting from the celebration, feeling the solid earth beneath their feet. This land, this life, this partnership. It was all so different from what Evelyn had been raised to expect, but it was real in a way her old life had never been. Luke, Evelyn said softly, thank you for choosing me, for seeing me when I felt invisible, for offering me freedom instead of another cage. Thank you for trusting me, Luke replied, for taking a chance on a quiet rancher who's better with horses than words, for choosing this life when you could have chosen safety. This is safety, Evelyn said with certainty. Real safety. The kind that comes from knowing you're valued for who you are, not what you represent. From partnership instead of possession. From love freely given instead of obligation forced. Luke kissed her then, tender and thorough, and Evelyn felt the last shadows of fear finally dissolve. Her father's legal threats would probably continue for a while, empty gestures from a proud man who couldn't accept defeat. Judge Blackwood might rage and bluster, but none of it mattered anymore. She was Evelyn Calder, wife and partner, woman of Wyoming territory, and she was free. As they walked back to join the celebration hand in hand, Evelyn looked up at the stars and thought she saw her mother there, smiling with approval. She had kept her promise. She had chosen her own path, even when it was harder. And she had found what her mother never had, true freedom, real love, and a future entirely her own. The music played on, carrying them into the night and toward all the tomorrows waiting to be written. Spring transformed into summer, and with it came the hard work of establishing not just a marriage, but a true partnership. Evelyn threw herself into ranch life with the same determination that had carried her through her first desperate months in Wyoming. She learned to doctor sick cattle, to mend fences in the blazing sun, to ride the property boundaries checking for problems. Her hands, already work-hardened, developed new calluses. Her body grew lean and strong from physical labor. But more than that, her spirit expanded into the spaces Luke and Sarah created for her. They made decisions together around the kitchen table. What crops to plant, which cattle to sell, how to allocate their limited resources. Luke never dismissed her suggestions because she was a woman or new to ranching. Sarah never treated her like an interloper in what had been a two-person operation. Slowly, painfully, Evelyn learned to trust that her voice mattered, that she could speak her mind without fear of punishment or dismissal. But peace, she was learning, was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of security in facing it together. 6 weeks after the court victory, another letter arrived from Montana Territory. This one bore her father's own handwriting, and Evelyn's hands shook as she opened it. Luke stood behind her, his presence solid and reassuring as she read. The letter was bitter with wounded pride and twisted justification. Marcus Hartwell wrote that she had disgraced the family name, that her mother would be ashamed, that she'd thrown away every advantage for a life of poverty and hardship. He called her marriage a mistake born of desperation, predicted she'd come crawling back within a year, and ended with a threat. If she ever tried to claim any inheritance or family connection, he would fight her with every legal means available. He's disowned me, Evelyn said quietly, feeling an unexpected pain despite everything. Made it official. I'm no longer his daughter. Luke read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. His loss. And frankly, good riddance to toxic obligation. I know you're right, but still. Evelyn traced her father's signature, remembering the man who'd once pushed her on garden swings, who'd applauded at her piano recitals, who'd existed before desperation had poisoned him. I mourn what he could have been, what we could have been to each other. Sarah entered from the garden, took one look at Evelyn's face, and immediately understood. She'd become adept at reading both her brother and his wife. at knowing when to offer comfort and when to offer distraction. This moment called for the former. Family isn't just blood, Sarah said firmly, pulling out a chair and sitting across from Evelyn. It's choice and loyalty and showing up when things are hard. Your father stopped being family the moment he tried to sell you. But Luke and I, Mary and Clara, and everyone who stood beside you, we're family because we chose each other. She's right, Luke added. Blood doesn't make family. Love does. Respect does. Standing together does. He took the letter from Evelyn's hands and walked it to the stove, opening the firebox and dropping it in. They watched it curl and blacken, Marcus Hartwell's words turning to ash. You're a Calder now. That's the only family that matters. Evelyn wiped her eyes, feeling the truth of their words settle into her bones. She had mourned the father she'd lost, or perhaps had never truly had, but she'd gained something far more valuable in return. A family built on choice rather than obligation, on respect rather than control. Thank you, she said simply, for everything, for being the family I needed instead of the one I was born into. Life moved forward with the steady rhythm of seasons and work. Summer heat gave way to autumn harvest, and the ranch prospered under their combined efforts. They sold cattle at fair prices, their modest profits allowing for improvements in savings. Evelyn started keeping bees, her patience and attention to detail making her a natural beekeeper. The honey became sought after in Red Willow and neighboring settlements, providing additional income and giving Evelyn something that was entirely hers to manage. She also began teaching some of the settlement children their letters and numbers, using the education she'd once thought useless to give others opportunities she'd taken for granted. The makeshift school met twice weekly in Mary's boarding house, and watching young minds engage with learning reminded Evelyn that her refined upbringing hadn't been entirely wasted. It had just needed the right application. Luke watched her transform from a woman learning to survive into a woman fully alive, and his love deepened into something that went beyond attraction or affection. He loved her strength and her vulnerability, her determination and her gentleness, the way she approached every challenge as if it were a puzzle to solve rather than an obstacle to fear. She made him laugh more than he had in years, challenged his assumptions, and filled the ranch house with warmth that had nothing to do with fireplaces. Winter returned, their first full year together completing its cycle. On the anniversary of their hasty marriage, Luke surprised Evelyn by leading her to the barn where he'd been working on something in secret. There, in the workshop space, sat a beautiful rocking chair crafted from oak, with their initials carved into the backrest along with the date of their marriage. I know it was fast, Luke said, suddenly uncertain in that way he still got when expressing feelings. I know it wasn't the wedding you might have dreamed of as a girl, but I wanted you to have something that marked it as real, as chosen. Evelyn ran her fingers over the smooth wood, the careful craftsmanship, the love evident in every detail. Luke called her, "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me. Not because it's fancy, it's not, but because you made it with your own hands. Because it's real and useful and permanent, like everything you've given me." She pulled him down to sit with her in the chair, both of them fitting despite its being made for one. They rocked gently, listening to winter wind outside and feeling the warmth of shared space. "I need to tell you something," Evelyn said, her heart racing with a mixture of joy and nervousness. "I've been waiting for the right moment, and I think this is it." Luke's arms tightened around her. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." "I'm pregnant," Evelyn said simply. "About 3 months along. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Luke went very still. Then slowly, carefully, he turned her to face him, his eyes searching hers with wonder. "A baby? We're going to have a baby?" "In late spring, the doctor thinks. Are you... Is this..." Evelyn trailed off, suddenly uncertain. They'd never discussed children, had been too focused on survival and legal battles and building their partnership. "Is this what?" Luke asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Am I happy?" "Evelyn, I'm beyond happy. I'm terrified and thrilled and already planning to build a cradle and worried about everything that could go wrong and imagining teaching our child to ride and..." He stopped, laughing at himself. "I'm overwhelmed, in the best possible way. Sarah was equally delighted when they told her, immediately beginning to plan and prepare with characteristic efficiency. Mary knitted tiny clothes and blankets. The community women rallied with advice, supplies, and support. Even Clara Donovan stopped by with legal documents ensuring that any children born to their marriage would have full legal rights and protection. A gift from a woman who understood that the law didn't always protect the vulnerable without careful documentation. Winter deepened, and Evelyn grew round with new life. She continued working as long as she could, then focused on indoor tasks when the cold became too harsh. Luke became almost comically protective, hovering whenever she climbed stairs or carried anything heavier than a teacup. She alternated between finding it endearing and exasperating, finally having to remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was hardly unique in needing to function while pregnant. "I know," Luke admitted one evening as they prepared for bed. "I know you're strong and capable, but Evelyn, you're carrying our child. Something we made together. The idea of anything happening to either of you." He couldn't finish the sentence. Evelyn took his face in her hands, making him look at her. "I'm not your mother. I'm not fragile or delicate. I'm a woman who survived more than most, and I'll survive this too. Our child will be born healthy, because I'm careful, because I have you and Sarah and an entire community supporting me. You don't need to carry all the worry alone, Luke. Share it with me. That's what partnership means." He nodded, pulling her close as much as her expanding belly allowed. "You're right. I'm sorry. It's just, I love you so much it scares me sometimes. The idea of losing you." "You won't lose me," Evelyn promised. "I didn't escape Montana and fight legal battles and build this life just to miss seeing our child grow up. I'm not going anywhere." Spring arrived with a violence of color and growth, the prairie exploding into wildflowers, the ranch coming alive with new calves and planting season. Evelyn's time grew close, and the community women took turns staying at the ranch, making sure she was never alone. Mary moved in for the final weeks, her experience with birthing both animals and humans making her invaluable. The labor began on a perfect May morning, the kind of day that promised endless possibility. It was hard, harder than any work Evelyn had ever done, more painful than she'd imagined. But Sarah held one hand and Mary the other, coaching her through contractions while Luke paced outside like a caged animal, unable to help, but unable to leave. After hours that felt like years, a cry split the air, thin and outraged and absolutely perfect. Evelyn collapsed back against the pillows as Mary worked efficiently, and then suddenly there was a small, wrinkled, beautiful person being placed in her arms. "A girl," Mary announced, beaming. "Perfect and healthy. Congratulations, Evelyn." Luke burst into the room despite propriety, his eyes wild with worry, until he saw Evelyn sitting up, tired but smiling, cradling their daughter. He approached slowly, as if in a dream, staring at the tiny face peeking from the blanket. "She's so small," he whispered, awed. "So perfect." "She's ours," Evelyn said, feeling tears stream down her face. Happy tears, grateful tears. "Our daughter, born free." They named her Rose, after the wallpaper in Evelyn's childhood bedroom and the garden her mother had loved. Rose Calder entered the world with a strong cry and her mother's determination, and from her first breath, she was loved beyond measure. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming joy, of learning to be parents while maintaining a ranch, of watching this small person grow and change daily. Rose was an easy baby, as if understanding that her parents were doing their best with limited experience. She slept in the cradle Luke had built, wore the clothes Mary and Sarah had sewn, and was passed around among the community women who all claimed to be honorary aunties. On Rose's first birthday, they held a celebration at the ranch. The same people who'd attended their wedding surprise gathered again, watching as Rose destroyed a small cake with enthusiastic hands, laughing at her delight in simple messiness. Evelyn looked around at these faces, her chosen family, and felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What are you thinking?" Luke asked, sliding an arm around her waist as they watched their daughter play. "I'm thinking about the girl I was 2 years ago," Evelyn admitted. Terrified and desperate, fleeing everything she knew. If someone had told her she'd end up here, married to a good man with a daughter and a home and a community, she wouldn't have believed it possible. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd made different choices? Luke asked. If you'd married Judge Blackwood, stayed in your father's world? I'd be dead, Evelyn said simply. Maybe not physically, though who knows with a man like Blackwood, but everything that makes me who I am, my strength, my voice, my autonomy, would have been slowly suffocated. That girl would have died, and some hollow shell would have taken her place. She turned to look at him. You didn't save me, Luke, but you gave me space to save myself. You offered partnership when I'd only known possession. That made all the difference. Sarah joined them, Rose balanced on her hip. Your daughter is a terror, she announced fondly. She just tried to eat a flower and succeeded before I could stop her. She's adventurous, Evelyn said, taking Rose and wiping cake from her face. Like her mother. God help us all, Luke said, but his eyes were soft with love. As summer rolled into autumn again, Evelyn received an unexpected letter. It bore a Denver postmark, and the return address was a law office she didn't recognize. Inside was a brief note from a lawyer handling Marcus Hartwell's estate. Her father had died, a stroke, sudden and fatal. He'd left no will, and his remaining assets would be divided among creditors. She was not mentioned, not even to be specifically excluded. She had been erased so completely that even death couldn't restore her to the family record. Evelyn read the letter twice, feeling curiously numb. She'd long since mourned her father, had let go of the hope that he might change or apologize, or acknowledge his mistakes. But death made it final in a way disownment hadn't. There would never be reconciliation now, never be a moment of understanding. Whatever they might have been to each other was lost forever. Are you all right? Luke asked, reading over her shoulder. I think so, Evelyn said slowly. It's strange. I feel sad, but not grief exactly, more like closure maybe? He can't hurt me anymore, can't threaten or pursue or demand. It's truly over. Do you want to go to Denver, pay your respects? Evelyn considered, then shook her head. No. That man stopped being my father when he tried to cage me. I mourned him long ago. This is just the official end of something that died years earlier. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her writing desk, next to the one other letter from her past she'd kept, Annie's original introduction to Mary Walsh. Everything else from Evelyn Hartwell's old life had been burned or discarded. These two pieces of paper were the only bridges between who she'd been and who she'd become. That evening, they held a small ceremony of sorts. Evelyn stood by the fire with Luke beside her, holding the letter from her father's estate lawyer. I forgive you, she said quietly to the memory of Marcus Hartwell. Not because you earned it, but because I don't want to carry anger anymore. You were a flawed man who made terrible choices. But those choices led me here, to this life, to this family. So I'm letting go of the bitterness. I'm choosing peace. She dropped the letter into the flames, watching it burn like she'd watched his disownment letter burn almost 2 years earlier. This time, though, there were no tears, just a quiet sense of release. I'm proud of you, Luke said simply. That took courage. No, Evelyn corrected. Courage was leaving. This is just housekeeping, closing old chapters so new ones have room to be written. The years that followed were marked by growth and deepening roots. Rose grew into a spirited child, equal parts Evelyn's determination and Luke's quiet strength. They had 2 more children, a son they named James after Luke's father, and another daughter they called Annie in honor of the woman whose courage had given Evelyn her first chance at freedom. The ranch prospered through their combined efforts and careful management. Evelyn's bees produced prize-winning honey. Her teaching expanded to include more children from surrounding areas, and her careful bookkeeping helped them weather droughts and harsh winters that broke less prepared operations. Luke's reputation for honest dealing and quality cattle grew, bringing buyers from as far as Colorado and Montana. Sarah eventually married a quiet surveyor named Robert, who understood that he was joining the Calder operation, not taking Sarah away from it. The little school that had started in Mary's boarding house grew into an actual building, funded by community contributions and Evelyn's tireless advocacy. She taught there 3 days a week, bringing education to children who might otherwise have none. She never forgot that her own education, once thought useless for frontier life, had given her options and opportunities. She wanted the same for every child in Red Willow, regardless of their family's wealth or status. Clara Donovan eventually ran for territorial office, becoming one of Wyoming's first female legislators. She never forgot the case that had tested both legal precedent and social convention, often citing it in her work to expand women's rights. Wyoming Territory became the first to grant women full voting rights, a victory Clara and others fought for tirelessly. Mary Walsh retired from the boarding house eventually, leaving it in the capable hands of a young woman who'd arrived much as Evelyn had, desperate and determined. Mary spent her final years being spoiled by Evelyn's children, who called her Gran and loved her fiercely. Annie Walsh, the maid who'd sacrificed her savings to give Evelyn a chance, eventually came west herself. She opened her boarding house in Red Willow, fulfilling the dream she'd deferred. Evelyn helped her get established, returning the gift that had changed her life. The two women became close friends, their bond forged in shared courage and mutual respect. Judge Cornelius Blackwood died after Evelyn had been gone 5 years. A heart attack suffered in the midst of arguing a case. Evelyn felt nothing when she heard the news, not even relief. He had no power over her anymore, had never truly had power except what her father had tried to give him. He was simply irrelevant to the life she'd built. On a golden autumn afternoon, 15 years after Evelyn had fled Montana Territory, she stood on the porch of the ranch house watching her children play in the yard. Rose, now 14, was helping James learn to rope a practice post. Annie, 8 years old and fearless, was attempting to climb onto a horse twice her size despite Sarah's warnings to wait for help. "They're going to give me gray hair before I'm 40, Luke observed, coming to stand beside her. "You already have gray hair," Evelyn pointed out, running her fingers through the silver threading his temples. "It makes you distinguished. It makes me old. How did we get 3 children who are all more stubborn than their parents combined?" "Genetics and environment," Evelyn said wisely. "They learn from watching us. Be stubborn. Be determined. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do." Luke pulled her close, and they stood together watching their children, their ranch, their life. It wasn't the life Evelyn had been raised for. It was better. It was real. "Do you ever miss it?" Luke asked, echoing the question he'd asked years ago on their wedding night. "The life you could have had?" Evelyn didn't even have to think about her answer. "I had the life I could have had, Luke. I lived it for 22 years. Silk dresses and piano recitals and social obligations and slow suffocation. If I'd stayed in that life, I'd have missed all of this. Real work, real partnership, real freedom. I'd have missed you. I'd have missed watching our children grow up strong and independent. I'd have missed becoming who I was always meant to be." She turned in his arms to look up at him, this man who'd offered her everything by demanding nothing. "I was banished for choosing myself over my father's ambition, and it was the greatest gift anyone ever gave me, because that banishment led me here, to you, to this family, to a life built on choice instead of obligation. I don't miss what I left behind, Luke. I celebrate it every single day." Luke kissed her, tender and thorough, and Evelyn felt the same flutter in her chest she'd felt years ago when she first realized she loved him. Some things didn't fade with time, they just deepened, growing roots that reached down to bedrock. "Mama, Papa," Rose called from the yard. "Come see, James finally got the rope over the post." They walked down together to celebrate their son's achievement, and as Evelyn praised James and helped Annie finally mount that too-big horse and laughed at something Sarah said, she realized this was the moment she'd want to remember forever. Not the dramatic escapes or legal battles or moments of crisis, but this. Ordinary life with extraordinary people. Simple joy built on solid foundation. Freedom measured not in grand gestures, but in daily choices. That night, after the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet, Evelyn pulled out her journal, a practice she'd maintained through all the years, recording her thoughts and experiences so that someday, perhaps, her daughters might read them and understand that women could choose their own paths, could survive and thrive outside the cages society built. She wrote about the day, about watching her children grow, about the peace she felt in this life she'd built. Then she turned back to the first entry, written in a boarding house room in Red Willow so many years ago, her handwriting shaky with fear and exhaustion. "Today I ran. Tomorrow I must learn to stand." She'd learned to stand. More than that, she'd learned to walk tall, to work hard, to love freely, to build a life that honored the sacrifice her mother had never been brave enough to make. She'd learned that freedom wasn't something granted by others. It was something claimed, defended, and lived into every single day. Evelyn closed the journal and looked around the bedroom she shared with Luke. Their bedroom, in their house, on their land, filled with their children and their choices. The room was simple compared to her childhood quarters, but it was infinitely richer. Because everything in it, every single piece of her life, had been freely chosen. She thought about this girl she'd been, standing in a yellow bedroom with rose wallpaper, staring at a wedding dress that represented a prison sentence. She thought about that girl's terror and desperation, her determination and courage, and she wished she could reach back through time and tell her, "Run, run fast and far and don't look back, because on the other side of fear is freedom. On the other side of loss is gain. On the other side of darkness is a light you can't even imagine yet." Her father had banished her for refusing to sacrifice herself for his ambition. Judge Blackwood had pursued her for daring to reject his possession. Society had condemned her for choosing independence over obligation. And in doing so, they had set her free. Free to discover her strength. Free to find real love. Free to build a life that honored her truth instead of their expectations. Free to raise daughters who would never question their right to choose, and a son who would respect women as equals. Free to be Evelyn Calder, woman of Wyoming territory, teacher and beekeeper and rancher and mother and wife, and most importantly, herself. The cowboy who'd offered her partnership had given her something far more precious than security or comfort or even love, though he'd given all of those too. He'd given her space to become who she was always meant to be, and in that space, she had flourished. As Evelyn prepared for sleep, she looked out the window at stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky. Somewhere beneath those same stars, other women were trapped in lives they hadn't chosen, caged by expectations they couldn't meet, slowly suffocating under the weight of other people's demands. She couldn't save them all, but she could live her freedom loudly, could demonstrate through her own life that there were other paths, other choices, other possibilities. She could teach her daughters that they never had to choose between love and autonomy, that real partnership enhanced rather than diminished them. She could teach her son that strength included gentleness, that protecting didn't mean controlling, that the greatest gift you could give someone you loved was freedom. And she could remember, always, that the moment her father banished her, the moment that seemed like the end of everything, had actually been the beginning of her real life, the beginning of her freedom, the beginning of her truth. Luke stirred beside her, reaching for her in his sleep, and Evelyn took his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own, the strength that had never been used to constrain her, the love that had liberated rather than imprisoned. "Thank you," she whispered to the darkness, to the universe, to whatever forces had carried her from Montana to Wyoming, from captivity to freedom, from fear to love. "Thank you for the banishment that became a blessing. Thank you for the loss that became a gain. Thank you for showing me that sometimes the worst thing that can happen is actually the best thing in disguise." She closed her eyes, feeling peace settle over her like a quilt, one stitched together from courage and community, from hard work and honest love, from choices made freely and lives built deliberately. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more moments of joy and struggle and growth. But Evelyn Calder would face them all standing tall, free, and unafraid, exactly as she was always meant to be. The end was really a beginning, and the banishment was really a liberation, and the cowboy's offer of freedom and love had been the truest promise ever made to her. She had been cast out and found everything. She had lost a family and built a better one. She had been told she would perish alone in the wilderness, and instead had discovered that wilderness was where she truly came alive. Her father thought he was punishing her. Instead, he had freed her. And for that, despite everything, Evelyn was grateful. She fell asleep with Luke's arm around her, her children safe in nearby rooms, her land stretching vast and welcoming outside, and her heart full of the knowledge that she had chosen well. Every step of the way, despite fear and uncertainty and danger, she had chosen well. And in the choosing, she had found not just freedom, but herself.